A gang of reckless bikers storms into a gas station on a deserted highway, bullying customers and employees. Little do they know, their victims are off-duty elite soldiers returning from a training exercise. What begins as a skirmish spirals into a high-stakes chase, leading to lessons in humility, discipline, and the true cost of violence. The hum of engines shattered the stillness of the late afternoon as a pack of bikers roared down the highway. Their leader, Axel, a towering figure with a leather vest and a perpetual scowl, signaled for the group to pull into a rundown gas station on the side of a desolate stretch of road. The station attendant, a wiry young man no older than 20, froze as the motorcycles screeched to a halt. He watched nervously as the gang dismounted, their boots clunking on the pavement like a death march. Inside the gas station, 3 customers were scattered among the aisles. An older man shuffled toward the register with a bag of potato chips. A young mother quietly shushed her toddler in the snack aisle, and, at the far corner, 3 individuals browsed the shelves with a calm demeanor that belied the chaos about to erupt. These 3 were Lucas, Nate, and Alara, off-duty elite soldiers on their way home from an intense training exercise. They had stopped for fuel and refreshments, blending in as ordinary travelers. Axel strode into the station with a swagger, followed by his gang. He made a beeline for the register, leaning over it menacingly. "Fill up all the bikes," he barked, tossing a crumpled bill onto the counter. The young attendant stammered a response but was quickly cut off when Axel's second-in-command, a wiry man with a jagged scar across his cheek, grabbed the money and flung it back at him. "You heard him," the scarred man sneered. "Move it, kid." The older man, near the register, hurriedly paid for his chips and shuffled out, avoiding eye contact with the bikers. The young mother clutched her child and made her way to the door as quickly as she could without drawing attention. Lucas, however, remained calm. His sharp eyes tracked every movement, taking in the bikers' aggressive posturing and calculating the potential for escalation. Nate, leaning against a shelf, exchanged a knowing glance with Alara. They were all trained to avoid unnecessary conflict, but the tension in the room was palpable. Axel grabbed a candy bar from a display and ripped it open without paying. "Nice place you got here," he said, his voice dripping with mockery. His gang laughed as they began pulling items off shelves, pocketing snacks and drinks. One of them knocked over a display of chips, sending bags spilling onto the floor. The attendant, visibly shaking, tried to muster the courage to protest, but his words caught in his throat. Lucas stepped forward, his voice steady and calm. "That's enough," he said, addressing Axel directly. His tone was firm but not confrontational, a carefully measured warning. Axel turned to him, a smirk spreading across his face. "And who's going to stop us? You." The room grew silent. Alara tensed, her hand instinctively moving toward the phone in case she needed to call for help. Nate shifted his stance slightly, ready to act if things went south. Lucas, however, held his ground, his expression unwavering. "We don't want any trouble," he said, "but you're scaring the kid behind the counter. Why don't you take what you need and leave?" Axel's smirk turned into a snarl. "Who do you think you are, huh? Some kind of hero?" He stepped closer to Lucas, trying to intimidate him. The soldier's training kicked in. Lucas remained calm, his hands loose at his sides, projecting a confidence that unnerved Axel. "Back off," Lucas said, his voice dropping an octave. For a brief moment, Axel hesitated, sensing that he might be picking a fight with someone far more dangerous than he appeared. But his pride wouldn't let him back down. He threw a punch aiming for Lucas's jaw. The move was sloppy, fueled by anger rather than skill. Lucas sidestepped effortlessly, grabbing Axel's wrist and twisting it just enough to send a clear message. Axel howled in pain as Lucas released him. The gang surged forward, but Nate and Alar were already in motion. Nate disarmed the scarred man with a fluid motion while Alar intercepted another biker, using his momentum to send him stumbling into a rack of snacks. The fight was over in seconds. The bikers were sprawled on the floor, groaning and disoriented. Axel clutched his wrist, glaring up at Lucas with a mixture of rage and fear. "You'll regret this," he spat. "No one messes with us and gets away with it." Lucas knelt down, meeting Axel's glare. "You're lucky we're not the kind of people who finish what you just started," he said quietly. "Walk away and leave these people alone." Axel growled but signaled for his gang to retreat. They stumbled out of the station, their bravado shattered. As they mounted their bikes and roared away, Axel shot Lucas a venomous look. The gas station attendant exhaled in relief, muttering his thanks to the soldiers. Alara helped the attendant clean up the mess while Nate checked on the remaining customers. Lucas, meanwhile, watched the bikers disappear down the highway. He knew this wasn't over. People like Axel didn't take humiliation lightly. As they returned to their vehicle, Lucas turned to his team. "Be ready," he said. "They'll be back." Outside, the sky darkened as the sun dipped below the horizon. The soldiers loaded their supplies and drove off, leaving behind a quiet gas station that still echoed with the tension of the encounter. Somewhere down the road, Axel's rage boiled. His mind churned with thoughts of revenge, and he vowed to teach those strangers a lesson they wouldn't forget. What he didn't know was that his impulsive fury would ignite a battle far beyond anything he could handle. The night air was thick with tension as Axel and his gang sped away from the gas station. The engines of their motorcycles roared like wounded beasts, their collective humiliation fueling an unspoken rage. Axel's face twisted into a snarl, his hand gripping the throttle so tightly his knuckles turned white. He didn't speak, and neither did his men. They all knew what was coming. They reached their clubhouse an hour later, a dilapidated structure at the edge of town that looked as rough as the gang themselves. The gang filed in, their boots clanging against the concrete floor. Axel threw his helmet onto a table, the sound echoing through the room. "What the hell was that?" he bellowed, his voice filled with venom. His men exchanged uneasy glances, none daring to answer. "Those nobodies made fools of us," Axel continued, pacing like a caged animal. His second in command, Rafe, the wiry man with the scar, stepped forward cautiously. "Boss, those weren't just random guys," Rafe said. "The way they moved, they knew what they were doing." Axel's glare landed on Rafe like a sledgehammer. "So what are you saying? We just let this slide?" "No, of course not," Rafe stammered. "But we need to be smart about this. If we go after them without a plan, we'll end up worse off than before." Axel slammed his fist onto the table. "We don't need a plan. We need to show those bastards what happens when you mess with us." His gang murmured in agreement, though their voices lacked conviction. Axel's pride was a driving force, and none of them dared to challenge it openly. Meanwhile, Lucas, Nate, and Alara were miles away, driving in silence. The glow of the dashboard lights illuminated their faces, each of them lost in thought. Lucas gripped the steering wheel, his expression unreadable. "They're not going to let this go," he said finally, breaking the silence. Nate leaned back in his seat, his arms crossed. "You think they'll come after us?" "I don't think. I know," Lucas replied. "People like that don't take humiliation lightly." Alara sighed from the back seat. "We should have just walked away." "They were terrorizing that kid," Lucas said firmly. "We couldn't just stand by." "I'm not saying you were wrong," Alara said. "I'm saying this isn't over, and when they come back, it won't just be fists." Back at the clubhouse, Axel gathered his men around a makeshift map of the area. His finger jabbed at the gas station's location. "They were heading east," he said. "Probably on their way home. We'll set up an ambush on Highway 12. They won't see it coming." Rafe hesitated before speaking. "Boss, if they're who I think they are, we need more than brute force. They handled us like amateurs back there." Axel's eyes narrowed. "Then what do you suggest, genius?" "We need leverage," Rafe said. "Something to even the playing field. If they're protecting people, they'll hesitate to fight back if innocent lives are at risk." The room fell silent. Axel's lips curled into a sinister grin. "Now you're talking." The next morning, Lucas and his team stopped in a small diner just off the highway. The place was quiet, with only a handful of customers scattered among the booths. They ordered breakfast, trying to shake off the unease from the night before. But Lucas couldn't relax. His instincts were screaming that trouble was coming. As they ate, a pickup truck pulled into the parking lot. Two men stepped out, their leather jackets emblazoned with the same insignia as the bikers from the gas station. Lucas's eyes met Nate's, a silent understanding passing between them. They were being followed. "Stay here," Lucas said, rising from his seat. He stepped outside, his movements deliberate but unthreatening. The two men leaned against their truck, smirking. "Morning," Lucas said, his tone neutral. "Morning," one of the men replied, his voice dripping with false cheer. "Nice day for a drive, huh?" Lucas didn't respond. He studied them carefully, noting the bulge in one man's jacket, a concealed weapon. "You lost?" Lucas asked. "Not at all," the man said. "Just thought we'd say hi to some new faces in town." Lucas's jaw tightened. "Well, you've said it. Now you can move along." The second man chuckled. "You've got a smart mouth, don't you? Our boss doesn't like that." Lucas stepped closer, his posture unyielding. "Tell your boss to leave us alone. You don't want this fight." The smirk vanished from the man's face. He opened his mouth to retort, but Lucas cut him off. "Go back to your truck, drive away, and don't follow us again." The two men exchanged uneasy glances before climbing back into their truck. They backed out of the parking lot, their bravado dissolving as Lucas watched them leave. Inside the diner, Nate and Alara had been watching from the window. When Lucas returned to the table, Nate raised an eyebrow. "Friends of yours?" "Not yet," Lucas said grimly, "but they will be." As the team got back on the road, Lucas's mind raced. The bikers weren't just angry, they were hunting them, and he knew the next encounter wouldn't be so easily resolved. Back at the clubhouse, Axel was preparing his men for the ambush. Weapons were distributed and plans were laid. Axel's pride burned like a fire, consuming his judgment. "Tonight," he said, "we remind everyone why no one crosses us." Rafe, standing in the corner, watched with unease. Something about this felt wrong, but he pushed the thought aside. Axel was his leader, and loyalty demanded he follow orders. Still, a seed of doubt had been planted. As night fell, Lucas and his team approached the stretch of highway where Axel's gang lay in wait. The soldiers' sharp instincts would be tested, and the bikers' reckless thirst for vengeance would ignite a confrontation far more dangerous than either side anticipated. The moon hung low over the stretch of Highway 12, its pale light casting long shadows on the asphalt. The air was heavy, pregnant with the kind of stillness that only comes before chaos. Lucas, Nate, and Alara drove in silence, each of them sharpened by the instincts that had kept them alive through countless missions. Their training had conditioned them to sense danger before it arrived, and tonight was no exception. Lucas gripped the steering wheel, his eyes scanning the dark road ahead. "Stay sharp," he said quietly, his voice barely audible over the hum of the engine. "They'll make their move soon." Nate, sitting in the passenger seat, nodded. "If they're planning an ambush, this stretch is perfect for it. Minimal lighting, no exits for miles." In the back seat, Alara checked the small medical kit she always carried, her fingers deftly inspecting its contents. "We need to avoid a fight if we can," she said. "If they force it, we make it quick and clean. No unnecessary risks." As the vehicle rounded a bend, Lucas caught the glint of metal in the distance. A row of motorcycles blocked the road, their chrome frames shimmering like fangs in the moonlight. Behind them stood Axel and his gang, their figures silhouetted against the faint glow of a distant gas station sign. Axel stepped forward, his arms crossed over his broad chest. "Showtime," Lucas muttered, easing the car to a stop. He killed the engine and opened the door, stepping out with deliberate calm. Nate and Alara followed suit, their movements smooth and unhurried. Axel's smirk was visible even in the dim light. "Evening, boys and lady," he said, tipping an imaginary hat to Alara. "Nice of you to join us." Lucas stood tall, his expression unreadable. "Move your bikes. We're not looking for trouble." "Too bad," Axel replied, his tone mocking, "because trouble's looking for you." At a signal from Axel, the gang fanned out, their numbers seeming to double as more bikers emerged from the shadows. Some carried chains, others crowbars. A few had firearms tucked visibly into their belts. Lucas's eyes flicked over them, taking inventory with a soldier's precision. "You don't want to do this," Lucas said, his voice steady. "Walk away while you still can." Axel laughed, a sharp, humorless sound. "You think you're in a position to give orders? Last night you embarrassed us. Now we're going to show you what happens when you cross the iron fangs." Lucas exchanged a glance with Nate and Alara. They didn't need words to communicate. Years of working together had forged a bond stronger than steel. Nate's hand drifted toward his pocket where he kept a small utility knife. Alara shifted her stance, ready to move at a moment's notice. The standoff stretched into an agonizing silence. Then, in a blur of motion, Axel drew a chain from his belt and swung it at Lucas. Lucas dodged, the chain slicing through the air inches from his face. Chaos erupted. Nate disarmed one of the bikers with a swift kick, sending a crowbar clattering to the ground. Alara used her agility to sidestep an attacker, landing a precise blow that sent him staggering. Lucas engaged Axel directly, their movements a deadly dance of strength and strategy. Despite their superior training, the soldiers were outnumbered. The bikers fought with raw aggression, their desperation making them unpredictable. Lucas managed to wrestle the chain from Axel's grasp, but the sound of a gun cocking froze him in place. "Enough!" Rafe's voice cut through the commotion. He stood at the edge of the fray, a pistol aimed squarely at Lucas. The bikers fell back, forming a loose circle around the soldiers. Axel wiped a trickle of blood from his lip, his eyes burning with fury. "Not so tough now, are you?" Axel sneered. Lucas's mind raced, calculating his next move. He raised his hand slowly, signaling Nate and Alara to do the same. "Let's talk about this," Lucas said evenly. "What's there to talk about?" Axel spat. "You humiliated me. You think I'm just going to let that slide?" "You've made your point," Lucas replied. "But this isn't the way. Someone's going to get hurt, and it doesn't have to be that way." Axel hesitated, his bravado faltering for a fraction of a second, but Rafe stepped forward, his pistol steady. "You don't get it, do you?" he said. "This isn't about a fight. This is about respect, and right now, you've got none." The tension was shattered by the wail of sirens in the distance. A pair of headlights appeared over the hill, the flashing red and blue lights of a police cruiser cutting through the darkness. Axel cursed under his breath. "Pack it up," he barked. "We'll deal with them later." The bikers scrambled, mounting their motorcycles and roaring off into the night. Rafe lingered for a moment, his eyes locking with Lucas's. "This isn't over," he said before holstering his pistol and climbing onto his bike. As the gang disappeared into the distance, the police cruiser rolled to a stop. A middle-aged officer stepped out, his hand resting on his holstered weapon. "Everything okay here?" he asked, his eyes scanning the disheveled group. "Just a misunderstanding," Lucas replied. "Thanks for showing up when you did." The officer nodded, his expression skeptical. "Be careful out here. This highway's not as empty as it looks." As the cruiser drove off, Lucas turned to his team. "We need a plan," he said. "This isn't going to stop until we stop it." Nate nodded, brushing dirt from his shirt. "We need to take the fight to them. Hit them where it hurts." Alara frowned. "And where would that be?" Lucas's gaze hardened. "Their base. We find it, we dismantle it, and we send a message they won't forget." The three of them climbed back into their vehicle, the night pressing in around them like a heavy shroud. The battle had only just begun, and they knew the road ahead would be paved with danger, but they also knew they couldn't back down. Not now. The sun rose reluctantly over the eastern horizon, its faint light struggling to pierce through the thick haze of the previous night's events. The aftermath of the ambush weighed heavily on Lucas, Nate, and Alara as they drove toward the next town. Their vehicle, though intact, bore scratches and dents, a testament to the chaos they had barely escaped. Lucas kept his eyes on the road, his knuckles white against the steering wheel. "We need to regroup," he said finally, breaking the oppressive silence. "Somewhere safe. Somewhere they won't think to look." Nate, seated in the passenger seat, ran a hand through his hair. "That's easier said than done. These guys know the area better than we do. If they're desperate enough, they'll tear the whole town apart looking for us." Alara, leaning against the window in the back seat, sighed. "We should have ended it last night. Now they're even more dangerous. Axel's pride won't let this go." Lucas glanced at her in the rearview mirror. "We made the right call. A full-scale fight would have drawn more attention and more casualties. We're not here to play hero. We're here to survive." Nate smirked humorlessly. "Survival's great, but it's hard to do when the enemy is planning their next move. Axel's not stupid. He's not going to come at us the same way again." Their conversation was cut short by a sign announcing the entrance to the small town of Red Pine. The town was little more than a collection of buildings scattered along a single main street. A diner, a hardware store, and a tiny motel were its most prominent features. Lucas slowed the car as they approached the motel, its neon vacancy sign flickering. "This will do," Lucas said, pulling into the gravel lot. The three of them climbed out, their movements stiff from fatigue and the lingering tension of the night before. Inside the motel, an elderly woman greeted them with a kind but curious smile. "You folks passing through?" she asked, her voice warm but tinged with suspicion. Lucas nodded. "Just need a place to rest for a day or two." She handed him a key, her eyes lingering on the faint bruises and cuts that marked their faces. "Room's at the end of the hall. Let me know if you need anything." Once inside the room, the team immediately fell into a routine born of necessity. Alara set up her medical supplies on the small table, tending to a scrape on Lucas's arm while Nate inspected their gear for damage. The room was sparse with 2 twin beds and a rickety chair, but it was enough. For now. "This isn't sustainable," Alara said quietly. "We can't keep running from them. Eventually they'll catch up, or worse, they'll hurt someone else trying to get to us." Lucas met her gaze, his expression unreadable. "I know. That's why we need to think bigger. Axel's gang is like a hydra. Cut off one head and another takes its place. We need to find the heart of the operation and take it out." "And how do you suggest we do that?" Nate asked, not looking up from his work. "We're on their turf. They've got the numbers, and they know the terrain better than we do." Lucas leaned back against the wall, his mind racing. "We need intel. Someone who knows the gang inside and out." Alara raised an eyebrow. "And where exactly are we going to find someone like that?" As if on cue, the sound of a motorcycle engine roared outside. Lucas peeked through the curtains. A single biker had parked in front of the diner across the street. The man was older, his leather jacket worn and patched. He walked with a slight limp as he entered the diner. "That's our guy," Lucas said. Nate frowned. "You don't even know who he is." Lucas shrugged. "Call it a hunch. He doesn't look like he's here to cause trouble. He looks like he's hiding." Alara sighed. "So what's the plan? Just walk up to him and ask for his life story?" "Something like that," Lucas said, grabbing his jacket. "Stay here. I'll handle it." Inside the diner, the biker was seated at the counter, sipping coffee. Lucas slid onto the stool next to him. "Nice bike," Lucas said casually. The man glanced at him, his expression guarded. "Thanks." "Doesn't look like you ride with the Iron Fangs," Lucas continued. The man stiffened. "What's it to you?" Lucas leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. "I'm not with them, if that's what you're worried about. In fact, they're the reason I'm here." The man hesitated. "You've got guts talking about them in the open. Either you're stupid or you're desperate." "Desperate, mostly," Lucas admitted. But I'm also looking for someone who knows how they operate, someone who's smart enough to stay out of their mess." The man studied Lucas for a long moment before speaking. "Name's Jace. Used to ride with them, back when they weren't so unhinged. What do you want to know?" Lucas smiled faintly. "Everything." Back at the motel, Alara and Nate watched from the window as Lucas and Jace exited the diner. Lucas gave them a nod, signaling things were under control. Jace's eyes flicked over the building. "Not much of a hideout," he remarked. "It's temporary," Lucas replied. "Come on, we've got work to do." Inside the room, Jace took a seat, his movements slow. He looked around. "You're not locals," he said. "Good guess," Nate replied. "We're not here to make friends. Just tell us what we need to know." Jace chuckled. "You're going to need more than information to take down Axel. He's a rabid dog. You corner him, and he'll tear you apart before he goes down." "Then we won't corner him," Lucas said. "We'll make him come to us." For the first time in days, they had a plan, or the beginnings of one. But with Axel's gang hunting them and the odds stacked against them, the road ahead would be anything but easy. The night was darker than usual, the thick clouds blotting out the moonlight. Axel and his gang were scattered along Highway 12, their ambush meticulously prepared. The Iron Fangs were on edge, their earlier humiliation burning fresh in their minds. Axel crouched by the roadside, his eyes scanning the horizon for headlights. His grip on the chain in his hands tightened as he imagined wrapping it around Lucas's neck. "Boss," Rafe whispered, crouching beside him, "we should have brought more firepower." "We've got enough," Axel growled. "They're just 3 people. No way they make it out of this alive." Rafe didn't argue, but the doubt in his eyes was clear. He had seen how Lucas and his team handled themselves, fast, efficient, and utterly without hesitation. Axel's plan was bold, but bold didn't always mean smart. Miles away, Lucas, Nate, and Alara sat in their vehicle, parked just off a dirt road. The tension was palpable as they reviewed the plan. Lucas had insisted on taking the fight to the bikers before they could regroup, but he wasn't about to drive into a trap without a strategy. "They'll be expecting us to take the main highway," Lucas said, pointing to a map spread across the dashboard. "So we won't. We'll come in from here." He traced a line along a back road that would lead them to the bikers' position. Nate nodded. "That gets us close, but we're still outnumbered." "Which is why we use the element of surprise," Lucas replied. "We hit them fast and hard, before they know what's happening." Alara leaned back, her arms crossed. "And if they've got guns?" "We adapt," Lucas said simply. His tone left no room for debate. As they approached the ambush site, Lucas killed the headlights and slowed the vehicle to a crawl. The trees on either side of the road closed in, their shadows stretching like claws across the dirt path. Alara peered through the window, her eyes sharp and searching for movement. "There," she whispered, pointing to a faint glint of metal in the distance. A line of motorcycles was partially hidden behind a row of bushes, their chrome surfaces betraying the bikers' presence. Lucas parked the car a safe distance away. "We go on foot from here," he said, grabbing a small duffel bag from the back seat. Inside were tools of their trade, compact weapons, flashlights, and a few improvised devices designed to disorient and disable. The 3 moved silently through the underbrush, their movements practiced and fluid. Nate took the lead, his eyes scanning for traps while Alara covered their rear. Lucas carried the bag, his focus entirely on the objective. Near the ambush site, the bikers were growing restless. Axel paced back and forth, his frustration mounting with each passing minute. "Where the hell are they?" he muttered. "Maybe they took a different route," one of the bikers suggested. "Shut up," Axel snapped. "They'll come this way. They have to." Before anyone could respond, a sudden burst of light and sound erupted from the tree line. Flashbangs detonated in rapid succession, their blinding light and deafening noise throwing the bikers into chaos. Lucas and his team emerged from the shadows, their movements precise and deliberate. Nate took out the first biker with a well-placed strike, his baton cracking against the man's temple. Alara disarmed another, her agility allowing her to sidestep his swing and deliver a sharp elbow to his jaw. Lucas targeted Axel, his presence commanding as he closed the distance between them. Axel swung his chain wildly, but Lucas ducked under the attack and landed a powerful punch to Axel's ribs. The gang leader staggered, his breath coming in ragged gasps, but his fury only grew. He lashed out again, forcing Lucas to retreat momentarily. The bikers, though disoriented, began to regroup. One of them raised a gun, but Nate was faster, throwing a compact knife that embedded itself in the man's shoulder. The weapon fell to the ground as the biker howled in pain. Alara spotted a biker sneaking up behind Lucas and threw a small device at his feet. The device emitted a high-pitched whine, causing the man to clutch his ears and stumble. Lucas took advantage of the distraction, delivering a swift kick that sent the man sprawling. Axel, now cornered, glared at Lucas with a mixture of rage and desperation. "You think this is over?" he spat. "You have no idea who you're messing with." Lucas didn't respond. Instead, he moved in with calculated precision, disarming Axel with a single fluid motion and pinning him to the ground. "It's over when I say it's over," Lucas said coldly. The remaining bikers, seeing their leader subdued, began to retreat. One by one, they mounted their bikes and fled into the night, their confidence shattered. Rafe hesitated, his loyalty to Axel warring with his instinct for survival. In the end, he followed the others, leaving Axel alone with the soldiers. Lucas released Axel and stepped back, his expression unreadable. "You're done," he said. "Stay out of our way, or next time, you won't get back up." Axel coughed, struggling to his feet. "This isn't over," he growled. "You'll regret this." Without another word, Lucas turned and signaled to Nate and Alara. They disappeared into the shadows, leaving Axel to stagger away, his pride and his gang in tatters. Back at their vehicle, the team regrouped, their breaths heavy but their spirits unbroken. "That went better than expected," Nate said, though his tone was far from celebratory. "It's not over," Alara said. "Axel's not the type to give up. He'll come back, and he'll be worse." Lucas nodded, his jaw set. "Then we'll be ready." As they drove away, the first rays of dawn broke over the horizon, painting the sky with hues of orange and gold. It was a fleeting moment of beauty in a night defined by chaos. But for Lucas and his team, it was a reminder that the fight was far from finished. The aftermath of the ambush left Lucas, Nate, and Alara in a state of grim determination. They knew Axel and the Iron Fangs weren't defeated, merely wounded. The bikers would return with renewed fury, and the soldiers couldn't afford to wait idly for the next attack. It was time to go on the offensive. In the dimly lit motel room, Lucas stood over a map of the surrounding area. Red Pine and the nearby roads were marked with pins and scribbled notes. Jace sat in the corner, his arms crossed as he watched the soldiers work. "So, what's the plan?" Jace asked, his tone skeptical. "You can't just charge into Axel's territory. He's got eyes everywhere." "We're not charging in," Lucas replied. "We're cutting them off at the knees." Nate leaned over the map, pointing to a cluster of marks near a warehouse on the outskirts of town. "This is their main hub, right?" Jace nodded. "Yeah. They keep most of their bikes, weapons, and supplies there. But it's not just a storage space. It's their hangout. You'll find at least a dozen of them there at any time, sometimes more." Alara frowned. "How do we get in without setting off alarms?" "You don't," Jace said bluntly. "They've got lookouts, cameras, and dogs. You step foot near that place and you'll have the whole gang on you in minutes." Lucas considered this for a moment, then nodded. "Good. Let them come." Jace raised an eyebrow. "You're planning to lure them out?" "Exactly," Lucas said. "We're not going to fight them on their terms. We're going to make them think they're in control, then take it away." The plan was simple but dangerous. The soldiers would infiltrate the warehouse under the cover of darkness, planting devices to disable the bikers' resources. If the gang responded quickly, Lucas's team would be ready to ambush them on neutral ground, away from reinforcements. That night, the team prepared for the mission with military precision. Ilara packed medical supplies while Nate checked their gear. Jace, despite his initial reluctance, agreed to guide them to the outskirts of the warehouse. "This feels like suicide," Jace muttered as they drove toward the site. "Axel's got too much at stake to let this slide." "Good," Lucas said from the driver's seat. "That's exactly what we're counting on." They parked the vehicle a mile from the warehouse, continuing on foot through the dense woods that surrounded the compound. The air was cold and still, every sound amplified in the quiet night. Nate took point, his sharp eyes scanning for signs of patrols. As they approached the warehouse, the faint hum of a generator reached their ears. Lucas signaled for the group to halt. Ahead, two bikers stood near the entrance, smoking and chatting in low voices. A security camera swept the area in slow arcs, its red light blinking ominously. "Two guards, one camera," Lucas whispered. "We take them out quietly." Ilara nodded, gripping the tranquilizer darts they had prepared earlier. She crept forward with cat-like stealth, using the shadows to her advantage. In one swift motion, she fired a dart into the neck of the first guard. He slumped to the ground, unconscious. The second guard barely had time to react before Nate incapacitated him with a precise chokehold. With the guards neutralized, Lucas motioned for the team to move in. They bypassed the camera's blind spots and slipped into the warehouse through a side entrance. Inside, the space was a chaotic mix of motorcycles, crates, and makeshift furniture. The faint smell of oil and sweat hung in the air. "Plant the devices," Lucas instructed. "We've got 5 minutes." Nate and Ilara moved quickly, placing small explosive charges on key structures, fuel tanks, electrical panels, and motorcycle engines. The devices weren't designed to kill, only to disable and disorient. Lucas kept watch, his ears tuned for any sign of the bikers. Suddenly, the sound of footsteps echoed from the far end of the warehouse. Lucas gestured for the team to hide. They ducked behind a stack of crates as 3 bikers entered, laughing and talking loudly. One of them paused, his gaze sweeping the room. "Something feels off," he muttered. "You're just paranoid," another biker replied. "Let's grab a drink and relax." Lucas waited until the bikers had moved deeper into the warehouse before signaling for his team to continue. They finished planting the charges and slipped back out the way they came. As they retreated into the woods, Lucas pressed a button on a small remote. The warehouse erupted in chaos. Explosions rocked the compound, shattering windows and sending plumes of smoke into the night sky. The bikers inside scrambled for cover, shouting and cursing as they tried to assess the damage. Back at the edge of the woods, Lucas watched the scene unfold with grim satisfaction. "That'll get their attention," he said. It didn't take long for Axel to arrive. He roared into the compound on his motorcycle, his expression a mask of fury. He barked orders, demanding answers from his disoriented men. Rafe stood nearby, his face pale as he surveyed the damage. "This was deliberate," Axel growled. "Whoever did this is going to pay." Lucas turned to his team. "We've done enough for tonight. Let's move." As they retreated to their vehicle, Jace shook his head in disbelief. "You're insane. You know that." "Maybe," Lucas replied, "but now we've got the upper hand." They drove away in silence, the faint glow of the burning warehouse fading into the distance. The soldiers knew their actions would provoke a response, but that was the point. Axel's gang was on edge, and their desperation would make them reckless. For the first time since the conflict began, Lucas felt the tides turning in their favor. The events at the warehouse were a turning point, but Lucas knew they wouldn't go unanswered. Axel's fury was palpable, and the Iron Fangs would waste no time hunting them down. The soldiers needed to stay ahead of the gang, but as dawn broke over the horizon, the tension in the air was impossible to ignore. The team had been driving for hours, taking back roads to avoid detection. Jace sat in the back seat, his gaze flicking nervously between the windows. "They're going to come after us," he muttered. "You poked the bear." "That was the idea," Lucas said, his voice calm but firm. "We needed to rattle them." "Well, congratulations," Jace shot back. "They're rattled, and when they catch up, they'll be bringing hell with them." Alara, sitting next to Jace, turned to him with a steady gaze. "We knew the risks. This isn't about avoiding them. It's about choosing where we make our stand." Jace shook his head. "I hope you've got a plan, because Axel's not the kind of guy who forgives and forgets." Lucas didn't respond. His focus was on the road ahead, scanning for anything out of place. The stillness of the morning was deceptive, and his instincts were screaming that something was about to happen. Nate, in the passenger seat, glanced at Lucas. "We've got company," he said, nodding toward the rearview mirror. Behind them, a group of motorcycles had appeared on the horizon, their engines roaring like a pack of wolves on the hunt. Lucas tightened his grip on the steering wheel. "Here we go." The bikers closed the distance quickly, their formation tight and aggressive. Axel was at the front, his face twisted in determination. He raised a hand, signaling his gang to fan out. They surrounded the vehicle, their engines revving menacingly. "They're trying to box us in," Nate said. "What's the play?" Lucas's eyes flicked to a narrow dirt road ahead. "Hold on," he said, turning sharply onto the path. The sudden move caught the bikers off guard, and the car kicked up a cloud of dust, momentarily obscuring their vision. Axel growled in frustration, signaling his men to follow. The bikers navigated the uneven terrain with ease, their motorcycles designed for off-road pursuits. Lucas pushed the car to its limits, the tires skidding on loose gravel as they weaved through the trees. "They're gaining on us," Alara warned, her voice tense. Lucas spotted a clearing up ahead and made a split-second decision. "We stop here," he said, slamming on the brakes. The car skidded to a halt and the team jumped out, taking defensive positions behind the vehicle. The bikers arrived moments later, forming a semicircle around them. Axel dismounted, his chain wrapped around his fist. "You've got nowhere to run," he called out. "Give up now, and maybe I'll make it quick." Lucas stepped forward, his posture calm but commanding. "This is your last chance, Axel. Walk away before it's too late." Axel laughed, the sound cold and humorless. "You think you're in a position to make threats? You're outnumbered, outgunned, and out of luck." Lucas didn't flinch. "We'll see." The tension was electric as the standoff stretched into silence. Then, with a roar, one of the bikers charged forward, raising a crowbar. Nate intercepted him with a swift strike, disarming him and sending him to the ground. The fight erupted in an instant. Alara moved with precision, using her environment to her advantage. She ducked behind a tree, drawing a biker into a trap before landing a devastating blow with her elbow. Jace, though initially hesitant, joined the fray, using a makeshift weapon to fend off an attacker. Lucas and Axel clashed in the center of the clearing, their battle a brutal exchange of strength and strategy. Axel swung his chain with wild force, but Lucas anticipated every move, his training giving him the upper hand. He ducked under a swing and delivered a sharp kick to Axel's knee, sending him staggering. The bikers, though numerous, were disorganized. Lucas's team exploited their lack of coordination, working together with practiced efficiency. Nate covered Alara's flank while Lucas kept the most dangerous opponents occupied. Axel roared in frustration, his pride fueling his attacks. He charged at Lucas, tackling him to the ground. The two grappled in the dirt, each trying to gain the upper hand. Axel's strength was formidable, but Lucas's discipline and focus gave him the edge. He rolled out of the hold and pinned Axel, twisting his arm until the chain fell from his grasp. "Stay down," Lucas commanded, his voice like steel. Axel spat a curse but didn't move. Around them, the bikers were retreating, their morale shattered by the soldiers' superior tactics. Those who could still ride mounted their motorcycles and fled, leaving Axel behind. Nate approached, his expression grim. "What do we do with him?" Lucas stood, pulling Axel to his feet. "We let him go," he said. "He's not a threat anymore." Axel glared at Lucas, his jaw tight. "You think this is over?" Lucas met his gaze. "It is, if you want to keep what's left of your gang." Axel hesitated, then wrenched his arm free and staggered to one of the abandoned motorcycles. He mounted it and rode away, his figure disappearing into the distance. The clearing fell silent, the tension dissipating like smoke. Ilara leaned against the car, catching her breath. "That was close," she said. "Too close," Jace added, his hands trembling. "You people are insane." Lucas gave him a faint smile. Maybe, but it worked. As the team climbed back into the car, the adrenaline began to fade, replaced by the weight of what was still to come. Axel might have been defeated for now, but Lucas knew the fight was far from over. As they drove away, the road ahead felt uncertain, the horizon painted with the fiery hues of a setting sun. The battle had been won, but the war was just beginning. The small town of Red Pine had always been quiet, unassuming. Its residents lived simple lives, blissfully unaware of the storm that was about to sweep through their streets. For Lucas and his team, the town offered a brief respite, but they knew that safety was fleeting. Axel and the Iron Fangs were relentless, and the aftermath of the highway standoff made it clear that they wouldn't stop until they had their revenge. The morning after the clash, Lucas and his team regrouped in their motel room. The atmosphere was tense, the weight of what lay ahead pressing heavily on them. Jace paced back and forth, his nerves visibly frayed. "They know we're here," he muttered, his voice sharp. "Axel's too stubborn to let this go. If we stay, we're putting this whole town in danger." Lucas folded his arms, his gaze steady. "We're not running. If Axel wants us, we'll deal with him. But we're not dragging innocent people into this." Ilara, leaning against the wall with her arms crossed, gave him a skeptical look. "And how exactly do you plan to protect an entire town? We're outnumbered and outgunned. This isn't just about us anymore." Lucas turned to the window, staring out at the quiet street below. "We'll find a way," he said finally, his tone resolute. Their discussion was interrupted by the distant rumble of motorcycle engines. Lucas moved to the window, his sharp eyes scanning the street. A group of bikers had arrived, their presence disrupting the usual tranquility of Red Pine. They stopped in front of the diner, their loud engines and boisterous laughter unsettling the few pedestrians nearby. "That didn't take long," Nate muttered, joining Lucas at the window. Jace's face paled. "They're scouting," he said grimly. "Testing the waters before the rest of the gang shows up." Lucas turned to the group. "We need to split up. Nate, Ilara, head to the diner. See what they're up to, but don't engage unless you have to. Jace and I will warn the sheriff." At the diner, Nate and Ilara watched the bikers take over a booth, their loud voices filling the small space. The waitress avoided their table, her fear written plainly on her face. Nate ordered a coffee and sat at the counter, his back to the bikers. Ilara browsed a nearby rack of magazines, keeping them in her peripheral vision. "They think they can mess with us and get away with it?" one biker said, his tone venomous. "This whole town's gonna pay for what those three did." Ilara exchanged a glance with Nate, her jaw tightening. The bikers weren't just after the soldiers. They were planning to make an example of Red Pine. Meanwhile, Lucas and Jace entered the sheriff's office, a small cluttered building that smelled faintly of stale coffee. Sheriff Collins, a stout man with a thick mustache, looked up from his paperwork as they walked in. "Morning," he said, eyeing them suspiciously. "What can I do for you?" Lucas wasted no time. "Sheriff, we need to talk. There's a gang heading this way and they're planning to cause trouble." The sheriff raised an eyebrow. "A gang? In Red Pine? You sure about that?" Jace stepped forward. "It's the Iron Fangs. They're bad news, and they're already here. If you don't act now, this town's going to get torn apart." Collins frowned, his skepticism giving way to concern. "All right, let's say I believe you. What do you expect me to do? I've got one deputy and a shotgun. That's not exactly an army." Lucas's voice was steady. "We're not asking you to fight them head-on. Just help us get the town ready. Evacuate the vulnerable, lock down key buildings, and let us handle the rest." Collins hesitated but eventually nodded. "Fine, but if this goes south, it's on you." As the bikers left the diner, their leader, a wiry man with a snake tattoo on his neck, scanned the street with a look of quiet menace. His expression promised violence, a warning that this was only the beginning. Back at the motel, the team reconvened. Lucas spread a map of the town across the small table, marking key locations. "We can't defend everything," he said, "but we can protect the people. Jace, where's the best place to make a stand?" Jace studied the map, his finger tracing the streets. "Here," he said, pointing to the town center. "It's narrow enough to control, but open enough to give us a clear line of sight." Lucas nodded. "Good. Alara, work with the sheriff to evacuate the vulnerable. Nate and I will fortify the perimeter. Jace, you're on lookout. Let us know the moment they make a move." The rest of the day was a blur of activity. Collins and his deputy went door to door, urging residents to leave or take shelter. Lucas and Nate worked tirelessly, turning anything they could find into barricades, trash cans, wooden pallets, even abandoned cars. Ilara transformed the town hall into a makeshift shelter, stocking it with supplies and ensuring it was ready for anyone who needed refuge. As night fell, the town felt like a powder keg waiting to explode. The usual hum of activity was replaced by an oppressive silence, the weight of anticipation hanging heavy in the air. Lucas and his team took their positions, their eyes scanning the darkness for any sign of movement. The Iron Fangs didn't keep them waiting. The roar of motorcycles shattered the stillness, the gang's headlights cutting through the night like fiery eyes. Axel led the charge, his presence commanding and dangerous. The bikers spread out, their engines revving like battle cries. Lucas stepped forward, his voice steady and firm. "This is your only warning. Turn back and leave." Axel laughed, a cold, humorless sound. "You've got guts, I'll give you that, but guts won't save you." The bikers surged forward and chaos erupted. The battle in Red Pine raged well into the night. The Iron Fangs pushed hard against the barricades, their desperation and fury driving them forward despite their dwindling numbers. Lucas and his team fought with precision and determination, but the weight of the conflict bore down heavily on them. The clash wasn't just physical, it was a test of their resolve, their ethics, and their humanity. As dawn approached, the streets of Red Pine were littered with the wreckage of the fight. Broken motorcycles, shattered glass, and the smoldering remains of barricades painted a grim picture of the night's events. The Iron Fangs had retreated for now, but the cost of the battle was evident. Lucas leaned against a lamppost, his breath coming in heavy bursts. Ilara approached him, her face lined with exhaustion. "We need to check on the town," she said. "Make sure everyone's okay." Lucas nodded, pushing himself upright. "Let's split up. Nate, take the south side. Ilara, you and Jace handle the shelters. I'll check in with the sheriff." The team dispersed, each of them moving through the battered streets. As Lucas walked toward the sheriff's office, he couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had settled in his chest. The battle had been necessary, but the collateral damage weighed heavily on him. Inside the sheriff's office, Collins was slumped in his chair, a bandage wrapped around his arm. He looked up as Lucas entered, his expression grim. "Hell of a night," he muttered. Lucas sat across from him. "How bad is it?" Collins gestured to a map of the town on his desk, marked with red circles. "A few buildings are gone. Some folks got hurt, but no fatalities, thanks to you and your team." Lucas exhaled slowly. "It wasn't just us. You held your ground." Collins gave a weak chuckle. "Barely. Those bikers weren't just out for revenge. They wanted to send a message." Lucas's jaw tightened. "They're not done. This was just a warning." The tension in Red Pine hadn't eased. Though the Iron Fangs had retreated, the battle left scars on the town, a stark reminder that peace was temporary. Lucas and his team worked tirelessly to fortify their position, but they knew Axel wouldn't stay silent for long. The next move wasn't an ambush. It was a message. The sound of a lone motorcycle broke the uneasy quiet. Lucas, helping Nate clear debris from the barricades, straightened as the rider approached. The man wasn't dressed like the typical Iron Fang. His black leather jacket bore no insignias, and his helmet was unmarked. He stopped a few yards away, cut the engine, and dismounted. Without a word, the man handed Lucas a folded note. "Axel sends his regards," he said flatly before turning and riding off, the roar of his motorcycle fading into the distance. Lucas opened the note, his expression darkening as he read. Nate moved closer, concern clear in his voice. "What is it?" Lucas handed him the note. "It's an ultimatum." Nate read aloud. "Midnight. The quarry. Come alone, or Red Pine burns." Ilara joined them, her brow furrowed. "He's trying to bait us. It's obviously a trap." "Of course it's a trap," Nate said, his frustration rising. "But we can't ignore it. If we don't show up, Axel will make good on his threat." Lucas folded the note, his gaze distant. "We won't walk into this blind. Let's regroup." In the cramped motel room, the team gathered around the table, the note placed in the center like a ticking time bomb. Jace leaned against the wall, his arms crossed tightly. This is exactly what Axel wants. He's pulling the strings, and we're dancing. "We don't have much choice," Lucas said. "If Axel's willing to destroy the town to get to us, we can't ignore him." "So what's the plan?" Ilara asked, her tone even. Lucas took a deep breath. "I'll go to the meeting, but I won't go alone. Nate and Ilara, you'll take positions around the quarry. If anything goes south, you'll have the upper hand. Jace, you stay here and keep an eye on the town. If this is a diversion, someone needs to be ready to defend it." Jace's eyes narrowed. "And if it's not a diversion, what happens when Axel turns this into a massacre?" "We won't let it get that far," Lucas said firmly. "We'll handle this." The room fell silent, the weight of the situation pressing down on them. Finally, Jace nodded reluctantly. As the sun set, the team prepared for what was to come. Ilara packed a medical kit with steady hands while Nate meticulously checked their weapons. Lucas remained quiet, his focus unbroken. Though he exuded calm, the strain of leading the team into another confrontation was evident in the tightness of his jaw. Before they left, Ilara approached Lucas, her voice low. "Are you sure about this? There's no margin for error." "I know," Lucas replied, "but we don't have another choice." The quarry loomed like a jagged wound in the earth, its steep walls casting eerie shadows under the pale moonlight. Lucas arrived alone, unarmed as the note had demanded. His footsteps echoed faintly as he made his way toward the open center. Motorcycle headlights flared in the distance. Axel emerged from the darkness flanked by several men. His chain dangled loosely in his grip, its links glinting faintly in the light. His grin was as sharp as ever. "You've got guts, soldier," Axel said, his voice carrying a mocking edge. "Or maybe you're just stupid." "Let's get to the point," Lucas said evenly. "What do you want?" Axel grinned, his teeth gleaming like a predator's. "What I want is simple. You, dead, but I'm feeling generous. Turn yourself in, and I'll leave Red Pine alone. That's the deal." Lucas gave a cold laugh. "Your word doesn't mean much, Axel." Axel's grin vanished, replaced by a sneer. "You think you're in control here? Look around. You're unarmed, outnumbered, and out of options." Lucas held his ground. "If you think I'm walking into your hands without a fight, you don't know me very well." As Axel ranted, Lucas's eyes flicked to the cliffs. He caught a faint glint of metal. Nate and Ilara were in position. They would act when the moment came. "You're not walking out of here alive," Axel snarled. But how you die, that's up to you. Lucas took a deliberate step forward, his voice steady. You're right, I've got nothing to lose. But you, keep pushing, and you'll lose more than you bargained for. Axel hesitated, his bravado faltering. Before he could respond, a sharp whistle echoed through the quarry, a signal from Alara. Nate's voice followed, magnified by a portable megaphone. Drop the chain, Axel, or your boys won't even have a chance. Axel froze, his gaze darting toward the cliffs. The faint gleam of Nate and Alara's weapons was unmistakable. You're bluffing, Axel growled. Try me, Nate replied coldly. For a tense moment, silence reigned. Then Axel raised his hand slowly, letting the chain fall to the ground. This isn't over, he hissed. Lucas didn't flinch. It is, if you know what's good for you. The bikers retreated, their engines roaring as they disappeared into the night. The weight of the encounter settled over Lucas as Alara and Nate emerged from the shadows moments later, their relief palpable. That was close, Alara said, her voice steady but tired. Too close, Lucas replied, but we bought some time. The fight wasn't over, not by a long shot, but for now, Red Pine had a chance to breathe. The aftermath of Axel's ultimatum left Red Pine on edge. The townspeople, already rattled by the recent conflict, now faced the grim realization that the Iron Fangs wouldn't stop until they got what they wanted. Lucas, standing in the center of the battered town square, knew time was running out. Axel might have retreated for now, but his next move would come quickly, and it would be devastating. Lucas gathered the team in the sheriff's office to strategize. Sheriff Collins, his arm still bandaged from the previous battle, leaned heavily against his desk. So, what's the plan now? He asked, his voice weary. We can't take another hit like that. We need to prepare the town, Lucas said firmly. If Axel comes back, Red Pine has to be ready to defend itself. Jace raised an eyebrow. You're talking about training civilians. Most of these people have never even held a weapon. They don't need to become soldiers, Lucas replied. They just need to know how to protect themselves and their homes. Collins nodded slowly. You've got my support, but convincing the townsfolk might be another story. A lot of them are scared, and some are ready to run. We don't need everyone, Lucas said, just enough to make a difference. The team split up to speak with the residents, knocking on doors and holding impromptu meetings in the town hall. The responses were mixed. Some people agreed to help, their fear outweighed by desire to protect their families. Others shook their heads, unwilling or unable to face the prospect of another fight. Lucas stood in front of a small group in the town square, his voice calm but resolute. I know you're scared, he said. I know you've already lost so much. But running won't stop Axel. It'll only make him stronger. If we stand together, we can show him this town won't be bullied. An elderly woman stepped forward, her weathered hands trembling slightly. What can we do? She asked. We're not fighters. You don't have to be, Lucas replied, but you can learn to stay safe, to watch for signs of danger, and to work as a team. That's all I'm asking. Slowly, more people began to nod. By the end of the day, a modest group of volunteers had gathered, ready to learn. Training began the next morning in an open field on the outskirts of town. Lucas divided the group into smaller teams, each led by a member of his squad. Alara focused on teaching first aid, using simple techniques that could save lives in an emergency. Nate worked with a group on basic self-defense, demonstrating how to disarm an attacker or escape a hold. Lucas stood with Sheriff Collins overseeing the progress. They're rough, Collins said, watching a young man struggle to hold a makeshift shield steady. But they've got heart. That's all we need, Lucas replied. Heart and a willingness to fight back. One of the volunteers, a teenager named Owen, approached Lucas hesitantly. Sir, can you show me how to shoot? Lucas studied the boy for a moment. He couldn't have been more than 16, his frame thin but wiry. "Have you ever used a firearm before?" Owen shook his head. "No, sir, but I want to learn." Lucas nodded. "All right, let's start with the basics." He led Owen to a small firing range they'd set up with the sheriff's help. Using an unloaded rifle, Lucas demonstrated how to hold the weapon, how to aim, and how to stay steady under pressure. Owen listened intently, his nerves evident but his determination clear. When it was time to fire live rounds, Owen's hands trembled as he aimed at the target. The first shot missed completely, but Lucas placed a steadying hand on his shoulder. "Breathe," he said. "Take your time. Focus on the target, not the noise." Owen's second shot hit the edge of the target. By his fifth shot, he was consistently hitting the center. A small smile broke across his face, the first Lucas had seen since they started. "You're a quick learner," Lucas said. "Keep practicing." As the days passed, the volunteers grew more confident. They weren't polished fighters, but they were no longer defenseless. The training also fostered a sense of unity among the townsfolk. People who had barely spoken to each other before were now working side by side, sharing meals and stories during breaks. Ilara noticed the change as she walked through the makeshift camp one evening. She found Lucas sitting by a fire, reviewing a map of the town. "They're starting to believe in themselves," she said, sitting beside him. "They're stronger than they think," Lucas replied. "They just needed a reason to see it." Ilara nodded. "And what about us? Do we believe we can win this?" Lucas hesitated, his gaze fixed on the map. "We don't have a choice," he said finally. "We have to." The final day of training ended with a mock drill. Lucas divided the volunteers into two groups, simulating an attack on the town. Nate led one group while Ilara coordinated the defense. The exercise was chaotic but effective, exposing weaknesses in their strategy and giving everyone a chance to learn from their mistakes. By the time the drill ended, the sun was dipping below the horizon. The volunteers gathered in the town square, tired but energized. Lucas stood before them, his voice carrying over the murmurs. "You've come a long way," he said. "You've proven that you're stronger together than any of us are alone. Axel will come back, but this time he won't find a town he can intimidate. He'll find a community ready to fight for what's theirs." The crowd erupted into cheers, their fear replaced by a growing sense of determination. For the first time since the conflict began, hope flickered in Red Pine. As the team walked back to the motel, Nate clapped Lucas on the shoulder. "You're a natural leader, you know that." Lucas gave a small smile. "Let's hope it's enough." The fight wasn't over, but Red Pine was ready. Whatever came next, they wouldn't face it unprepared. The mood in Red Pine shifted from hopeful to tense in the blink of an eye. After days of training and preparation, the town had begun to feel a sense of empowerment. But Lucas knew better than to let his guard down. Axel and the Iron Fangs were biding their time, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. That moment came sooner than anyone expected. It started with a faint, distant rumble in the early hours of the morning. Lucas, sitting in the sheriff's office with a cup of coffee in hand, tensed immediately. He recognized the sound, the low, menacing growl of motorcycle engines. Standing abruptly, he motioned for Sheriff Collins, who was half asleep at his desk. "They're coming," Lucas said, his voice calm but firm. Collins jolted upright, grabbing his shotgun. "How many?" Lucas moved to the window, scanning the dark horizon. The faint flicker of headlights grew steadily brighter. "Enough," he replied grimly. "Sound the alarm." The makeshift warning system, a series of metal pipes and car horns rigged to echo through the town, was activated within minutes. The sharp, piercing sound jolted the residents awake, sending them scrambling to their positions. Lucas and his team had drilled this scenario repeatedly during training, but the reality of the moment sent adrenaline coursing through everyone's veins. Ilara met Lucas near the barricades, her rifle slung over her shoulder. "How much time do we have?" she asked. "Not enough," Lucas replied. "Get everyone into position. Make sure the volunteers know to stick to the plan. Fall back if they get overwhelmed." Nate jogged up, his expression grim. "I counted at least 20 bikes, maybe more. They're spread out, trying to flank us." Lucas nodded. "We stick to the defensive line. Don't engage unless they get close." As the iron fangs closed in, the growl of their engines became deafening. The bikers didn't bother hiding their approach. They wanted Redpine to know they were coming. Axel led the pack, his signature chain swinging from the handlebars of his bike. The first wave hit the barricades with brutal force. The bikers hurled Molotov cocktails and makeshift explosives, igniting parts of the town in flames. The volunteers held their ground, throwing buckets of sand and water onto the fires while others returned fire from behind cover. Lucas shouted orders over the chaos, his voice cutting through the roar of engines and gunfire. "Hold the line. Don't let them breach the barricades." Near the south side of town, Nate's group faced the brunt of the attack. One of the younger volunteers, a girl named Clara, panicked as a biker charged toward her with a crowbar. Nate intercepted the biker with a swift tackle, disarming him before pulling Clara to safety. "You're okay," Nate said, his tone steady despite the chaos. "Stick to the plan. Watch your teammates' backs." Clara nodded, her hands shaking as she repositioned behind a stack of crates. Meanwhile, Ilara moved through the eastern flank, her sharp eyes scanning for injured townsfolk. She spotted Owen pinned down near a burning vehicle, his rifle jammed. Without hesitation, she sprinted toward him, firing a precise shot that sent his assailant scrambling. "Get up," she shouted, helping Owen to his feet. "Stay close and keep moving." At the center of the chaos, Axel's voice rang out, amplified by a makeshift megaphone. "Lucas, you can't hide forever. Come out and face me, or I'll burn this town to the ground." Lucas ignored the taunt, his focus on coordinating the defense. But when he saw Axel's men begin to plant explosives near the barricades, he knew he couldn't wait any longer. "Cover me!" Lucas barked, charging toward the bikers with calculated precision. Nate and Ilara provided covering fire, forcing Axel's men to scatter. Lucas reached the planted explosives, disarming two before being forced to dive behind cover as bullets whizzed past his head. Axel, spotting Lucas, roared in fury. "There you are," he shouted, revving his bike and charging toward him. Lucas rolled to the side at the last second, narrowly avoiding Axel's attack. He rose to his feet just as Axel dismounted, his chain swinging menacingly. The two squared off in the middle of the battlefield, the chaos of the fight fading into the background. "You've got guts, I'll give you that," Axel sneered, "but guts won't save you." "We'll see," Lucas replied, his tone calm. Axel lunged, swinging the chain with brutal force. Lucas ducked, countering with a precise strike that caught Axel off guard. The fight was brutal and fast, each man landing blows that left the other staggered. Finally, Lucas managed to disarm Axel, knocking the chain from his hands. He pressed a boot against Axel's chest, pinning him to the ground. "Call them off," Lucas demanded, his voice deadly serious. Axel spat blood, his defiance unyielding. "This isn't over." Lucas leaned closer. "If you care about what's left of your gang, you'll stand down." After a tense moment, Axel signaled to his men. The bikers, many of them injured or out of ammunition, began retreating reluctantly. Engines roared as they sped out of town, leaving behind smoldering debris and wounded pride. As the dust settled, the residents of Red Pine emerged from their hiding places. The town was battered but still standing, its people shaken but alive. Lucas stood amidst the wreckage, his team gathering around him. "We held them off," Ilara said, her tone both relieved and exhausted. "For now," Lucas replied, "but they'll be back." Nate placed a hand on Lucas's shoulder. "When they do, we'll be ready." The fight had taken its toll, but it had also solidified the resolve of the townspeople. Red Pine wasn't just a target anymore, it was a community willing to fight for its survival. The morning after the Iron Fang's retreat, Red Pine was a town on edge. Though the immediate threat had passed, the tension in the air was palpable. Lucas and his team worked tirelessly, helping the townspeople clear debris and assess the damage. Yet, in the back of Lucas's mind, a nagging question lingered. When would Axel return, and what would he bring with him? It was mid-afternoon when the unexpected happened. Nate was patrolling the outskirts of town when he spotted a group of vehicles approaching from the west. He quickly radioed Lucas. "We've got company. Looks like trucks, a few dirt bikes, and a van." Lucas, standing by the remnants of the town's barricades, stiffened. "Iron Fangs?" "Doesn't look like it," Nate replied. "They're flying a white flag." Lucas frowned. "Hold your position. I'm on my way." By the time Lucas arrived, the vehicles had stopped just outside Red Pine's perimeter. A group of men and women stood beside them, their hands visible and their postures non-threatening. At their center was a tall, rugged man with salt and pepper hair, wearing a leather jacket that looked worn from years of use. "I'm looking for Lucas," the man called out, his voice steady. Lucas stepped forward cautiously, his hand resting near his holstered weapon. "You found him. Who are you?" The man raised his hand slightly, a gesture of peace. "Name's Victor. My crew and we've been tracking the Iron Fangs for a while. Heard they hit this town." Lucas's eyes narrowed. "And what do you want?" "To help," Victor said simply. "We've got a score to settle with Axel." Victor's crew consisted of about 15 people, an eclectic mix of former bikers, mechanics, and ex-military. They called themselves the Strays, a name that fit their ragtag appearance. Lucas, wary of their intentions, brought them into the town hall for a meeting. Seated around a large table, Victor leaned back in his chair, his expression serious. "Axel's gang isn't what it used to be. They've been growing, taking in anyone willing to follow him, but that's made them sloppy. We've been hitting their supply lines, cutting off their fuel and ammo." Elara crossed her arms, skepticism written all over her face. "And why would you do that?" Victor met her gaze evenly. "Because Axel's a plague. He tore apart my hometown 10 years ago, left nothing but ashes. I've been hunting him ever since." Nate, sitting beside Elara, leaned forward. "And what's stopping you from turning on us the moment Axel's gone?" Victor smirked faintly. "We're not looking for a power grab. We just want to see Axel fall. After that, we'll be on our way." Lucas studied Victor closely. The man's words rang true, but trust was a luxury he couldn't afford. "If we let you help, you follow my lead. No freelancing, no surprises. Agreed?" Victor nodded. "Agreed." The Strays proved their worth almost immediately. While Red Pine's residents focused on rebuilding, Victor's crew scouted the surrounding area, setting traps and gathering intel. One of their scouts, a wiry woman named Jess, reported back with valuable information. Axel's gang was regrouping at an abandoned factory 20 miles away. "They're licking their wounds," Jess explained, spreading a map across the table. "But they won't stay down for long. If we're going to hit them, now's the time." Lucas studied the map, his jaw tightening. "We don't have the numbers for a direct assault. Even with your help, it's too risky." Victor nodded. "That's why we don't hit them head-on. We go after their supplies, their fuel, their weapons, force them to fight on empty." Nate grinned. "Sounds like my kind of plan." The first operation came together quickly. Under cover of night, a small team infiltrated one of the Iron Fang's fuel depots. Victor led the charge, his movements precise and methodical. Lucas watched from a distance, impressed by the man's efficiency. The depot raid was a success. The Strays disabled several vehicles, destroyed fuel reserves, and slipped away before the Iron Fangs could mount a response. By morning, Axel's forces were scrambling to recover. Red Pine's residents, though initially wary of the newcomers, began to warm up to them. Victor's crew shared their supplies and helped fortify the town's defenses. A young mechanic named Ryan even took it upon himself to repair the town's generator, restoring power to several key buildings. Alara, watching Ryan work, turned to Victor. "Your people are good," she admitted reluctantly. Victor chuckled. "We've had a lot of practice." Despite the victories, Lucas remained cautious. That night he approached Victor as they stood watch on the outskirts of town. "You've been fighting Axel for a long time," Lucas said. "Why now? Why help us?" Victor didn't answer immediately. He stared out at the dark horizon, his expression distant. "Because I see what Axel's doing here. He's not just taking over, he's trying to break you, and I can't stand by and let that happen." Lucas nodded slowly. "We'll stop him, together." Victor glanced at him, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Let's hope you're right." As the days passed, the alliance between Redpine and the Strays grew stronger. They shared meals, stories, and a common goal: to stand against Axel and his gang. But Lucas knew the hardest battles were yet to come. Axel wouldn't stay on the defensive for long, and when he struck again, it would take everything they had to hold him back. For the first time, though, Lucas felt something he hadn't in weeks: hope. They weren't alone anymore. The alliance with the Strays brought a new sense of purpose to Redpine. For the first time since the Iron Fangs had descended upon the town, there was a sliver of hope. But even as progress was made, the shadow of Axel's inevitable return loomed large. Lucas spent the days working tirelessly with Victor and his team, preparing for the battles yet to come. The Strays shared their expertise, teaching Redpine's residents how to reinforce their defenses and lay traps. It wasn't just about survival anymore, it was about standing firm, sending a message that Redpine wouldn't fall without a fight. One evening, Lucas stood by the perimeter, watching the sunset cast an orange glow over the barren landscape. The town felt strangely peaceful, as if holding its breath. Alara approached, her footsteps quiet on the dirt path. "Thinking about the fight?" she asked, her voice soft. "Always," Lucas admitted. "But more than that, I'm thinking about what happens after." Alara raised an eyebrow. "You're planning that far ahead?" "I have to," Lucas replied. "If we win, what happens to this town? To these people? They can't go back to the way things were." Alara nodded, her gaze distant. "They're stronger now, but it'll take time for them to feel safe again. If they ever do." Lucas sighed. "That's the weight of leadership, isn't it? Making choices that don't just affect now, but everything that comes after." Alara placed a hand on his shoulder. "Whatever happens, you've given them a chance. That's more than anyone else could have done." The Strays had brought supplies with them: extra ammunition, medical gear, and even a few pieces of salvaged armor. Victor and Jess spent their days working with the residents to fortify the town's most vulnerable areas. Meanwhile, Ryan, the mechanic, transformed the town's remaining vehicles into makeshift armored transports. "Never thought I'd be turning farm trucks into battle wagons," Ryan joked, wiping grease from his hands as he showed Lucas a reinforced pickup. "But I'd say this beauty can take a hit or two now." Lucas nodded approvingly. "Good work, Ryan. Let's hope it holds." The evenings were quieter, a brief reprieve from the chaos. Around the campfires, the residents and Strays shared stories, their laughter a reminder of the humanity they were fighting to protect. Even Jace, usually withdrawn, found himself opening up, recounting tales from his days in the military. Nate leaned closer to the fire, his voice carrying over the crackle of flames. "You know, for all the fighting and chaos, it's moments like this that remind me why we do what we do." Victor, sitting across from him, raised a brow. "And what's that?" "Because people deserve this," Nate said simply, gesturing to the group. "A chance to sit around a fire, tell stories, and feel normal." Victor nodded slowly. "I'll drink to that." The next morning, Lucas called a meeting in the town hall. A map of the surrounding area was spread across the table, marked with notes and plans. "Axel isn't going to stay quiet for long," he began, his voice steady. "We've disrupted his operations and he knows Red Pine is a threat. When he comes, he'll come hard." Victor pointed to a series of red circles on the map. "We've set traps along these routes, spike strips, barricades, even a few surprises. It won't stop them, but it'll slow them down." "And the residents?" Alara asked. "They're as ready as they'll ever be," Lucas replied, "but we can't expect them to hold the line alone. Our job is to take the brunt of the attack, keep Axel's forces focused on us." Jace, sitting at the far end of the table, frowned. "And if they break through?" Lucas met his gaze. "Then we fight them in the streets, house by house if we have to." The room fell silent, the weight of the plan settling over everyone. Finally, Victor broke the tension with a determined nod. "It's a good plan. Risky, but it's the best shot we've got." As the sun dipped below the horizon that evening, Lucas walked through the town, checking on the defenses and speaking with the volunteers. Owen, the teenager he'd trained to shoot, was standing guard near one of the barricades, his rifle resting on his shoulder. "Nervous?" Lucas asked. Owen nodded. "A little, but I want to do my part." "You've come a long way," Lucas said. "Just remember your training. Stay calm, stay focused, and you'll be fine." Owen managed a small smile. "Thanks, sir." Further down the line, Clara was helping secure sandbags around a key position. She looked up as Lucas approached. "We're almost done here," she reported. "Good," Lucas said. "You're doing great work, Clara. Keep it up." Later that night, as the town settled into an uneasy quiet, Lucas joined Victor on the outskirts. They stood side by side, their gazes fixed on the dark horizon. "Funny, isn't it?" Victor said after a long silence. "The calm before the storm almost makes you forget what's coming." Lucas glanced at him. "Does it?" Victor smirked faintly. "Not really, but I like to pretend." Lucas nodded, his expression thoughtful. "We've done everything we can. Now we wait." "And when it comes," Victor added, his tone resolute, "we hit them harder than they've ever been hit before." Lucas didn't reply, but his silence spoke volumes. Together, they stood watch as the first stars appeared in the sky, the weight of the coming battle pressing heavily on their shoulders. The Iron Fang's hideout buzzed with tension. Inside the dimly lit confines of the abandoned factory, Axel paced the floor, his boots echoing off the concrete walls. His men avoided his gaze, sensing the storm brewing within their leader. They had suffered a humiliating retreat from Red Pine, and the sting of that defeat had festered. Axel slammed his fist against a rusted steel table, scattering papers and maps. "How did it come to this?" he growled. Deacon, Axel's right-hand man, stepped forward hesitantly. "We underestimated them. Lucas isn't just some small-town hero. He's a tactician." Axel spun to face him, his eyes blazing. "Don't tell me what I already know. I want solutions, not excuses." Deacon held his ground, his tone measured. "We regroup. Hit them harder, faster. They can't outlast us." Axel stared at him for a moment, then turned away, his expression unreadable. "Numbers aren't enough. Red Pine has something we don't. Unity." The admission surprised even Axel. He clenched his fists, struggling to reconcile his rage with creeping doubt. Deacon remained silent, knowing better than to prod when Axel's temper was on edge. In his quarters, Axel sat alone, a bottle of whiskey on the table. He took a long swig, the burn doing little to dull the turmoil inside. Memories surfaced, images of a small town where he had grown up. Back then, Axel was just a scrappy teenager named Jack, eager to prove himself. He had dreams of escape, but life had other plans. Axel's father had been a hard man, a drinker with a temper. Jack learned to fight not for sport, but for survival. When the factory closed, the town fell apart. Left with nothing but anger, he joined a gang. At first it was a means to survive, but over time it became something darker. He remembered the first time he'd seen real power, the way it could bend people to his will. He wasn't Jack anymore. Jack was weak. Jack dreamed too much. Axel was stronger, sharper, and ruthless. That was how you survived. But watching Lucas rally those people, seeing them fight with a tenacity that reminded him of his younger self, it unsettled him. It brought Jack back. Axel stared at the empty glass in his hand, his reflection distorted in the amber residue of whiskey. For a moment, he felt like that boy again, staring at the wreckage of a life he had no control over. But he shook it off. He couldn't afford weakness. Deacon entered without knocking, snapping Axel back to the present. "We need to talk." Axel gestured for him to sit. "What now?" "The men are restless," Deacon said. "Some are questioning your leadership after Red Pine." Axel's eyes narrowed. "Who?" "Does it matter?" Deacon replied. "We need to act soon or risk losing control." Axel leaned back in his chair, his expression cold. "Let them doubt. If anyone thinks they can do better, they're welcome to try." Deacon's tone softened. "I'm not here to challenge you. I'm here to remind you why we started this. You wanted to build something stronger than the world that chewed us up and spat us out." Axel's jaw tightened. "And what do you think Red Pine represents? They're in the way of everything we've built." "Or," Deacon countered, "they're what we could have been." The words hung in the air. Axel poured another glass of whiskey, the amber liquid catching the dim light. "They won't stop," Axel said. "If we leave them alone, they'll come for us." Deacon nodded. "Maybe. But if we destroy them, what's left? Another pile of ashes? Another story about how we burned everything we touched?" Axel didn't answer. For the first time in years, he felt unsure of his path. The fire that had driven him was flickering. Later that night, Axel wandered through the factory, his steps aimless. In one corner, a young recruit cleaned his weapon. The kid couldn't have been older than 17, his face soft with boyhood. "Where are you from?" Axel asked abruptly. The recruit looked up, startled. "Small town out west. Nothing special." Axel nodded. "Why'd you join?" The kid hesitated. "Didn't have anywhere else to go. Figured this was better than starving." Axel stared at him. "And is it?" The recruit didn't answer. Axel walked away, the silence speaking louder than words. Before dawn, Axel stood on the factory's rooftop, staring at the dark expanse beyond. The stars were faint, obscured by the haze of industry and smoke. He thought about Red Pine, Lucas, and the kid cleaning his rifle. He thought about Jack, the boy he used to be. For the first time in years, Axel questioned whether he was on the right path. But doubt was dangerous, and in his world, it could get you killed. As the first light of morning crept over the horizon, Axel made his decision. Whatever doubts he had, there was no turning back now. Red Pine would fall, because if it didn't, everything he'd built would mean nothing. Axel descended from the rooftop, his expression hardened. The storm was coming, and he intended to be the one to weather it. The morning in Red Pine started with an air of quiet unease. Lucas stood near the edge of the town, overlooking the dirt road that wound toward the horizon. It had been a tense night, with scouts reporting unusual movements from the Iron Fangs. Axel was preparing something big, and Lucas could feel it in his gut. Ilara approached, her boots crunching softly on the gravel. "You've been out here for hours. Any sign of them?" Lucas shook his head, his eyes still scanning the horizon. "Not yet, but it's coming. We need to act before Axel has the upper hand." Ilara frowned. "You're not seriously thinking of taking the fight to them, are you? We've barely got the numbers to hold the line here." Lucas turned to her, his expression grim but resolute. "If we wait for Axel to make the first move, we're finished. We need to hit them where it hurts, disrupt their plans before they can overwhelm us. Alara crossed her arms, her skepticism evident. And what exactly is your plan? Lucas hesitated for a moment before speaking. We infiltrate their camp, take out their supplies, sabotage their vehicles, anything to slow them down. Alara's eyes widened. That's a suicide mission. It's a calculated risk, Lucas countered, and it's our best shot. The town hall was silent as Lucas presented his plan to the assembled group. A map of the surrounding area lay spread across the table, marked with notes and routes. Victor leaned over it, his expression serious. You're talking about sneaking into the Iron Fang's stronghold with a handful of people, Victor said. You realize what happens if you get caught? We don't have the luxury of playing it safe, Lucas replied. Axel is building his forces. If we wait, he'll crush us. This is our chance to take the fight to him, on our terms. Nate, sitting near the back, nodded. I'm in. We've faced worse odds before. Alara sighed, her frustration clear. I still think this is insane. But if you're going, I'm not letting you do it alone. Victor glanced around the room before speaking. All right, if we're doing this, we do it smart. Jess and I can provide intel on their patrol routes. We'll give you the best chance to slip in undetected. Lucas nodded. Good, we move tonight. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Lucas and his team prepared for the mission. Alara checked her rifle, her movements precise and focused. Nate adjusted the straps on his gear, his usual grin replaced by a steely determination. Victor handed Lucas a small device. It's a signal jammer. It won't last long, but it'll buy you time if things go south. Lucas took it, his expression grateful. Thanks. Victor hesitated before speaking. Be careful out there. Axel's men won't show mercy if they catch you. Lucas nodded, his gaze unwavering. We know what's at stake. The group moved under the cover of darkness, their footsteps muffled against the soft dirt. Jess had provided detailed intel on the Iron Fang's patrols, allowing them to navigate the outskirts of the camp undetected. The faint glow of fires and the low murmur of voices marked the edge of the enemy's territory. Alara signaled for the group to stop, her hand raised. She pointed toward a cluster of vehicles parked near a large tent. There, that's where they're keeping their fuel and supplies. Lucas nodded. Nate, you're on lookout. Alara and I will plant the charges. The group split up, each moving with practiced precision. Lucas and Alara crept toward the vehicles, their movements silent and deliberate. The faint smell of gasoline filled the air as they reached the fuel reserves. Alara handed Lucas a small explosive charge. Set it here, she whispered, her voice barely audible. Lucas nodded, placing the charge carefully. He glanced around, his senses heightened before moving to the next vehicle. Meanwhile, Nate spotted a pair of guards approaching from the east. He raised his hand to signal Lucas and Alara, his heart pounding in his chest. The guards were laughing, their footsteps unsteady, likely from too much drinking. But they were armed, and even a moment of carelessness could mean disaster. Lucas finished setting the final charge and motioned for Alara to retreat. They moved back toward the shadows, their breaths shallow as the guards passed within a few feet of their hiding spot. Nate exhaled slowly as the guards continued on their way, oblivious to the danger lurking nearby. With the charges in place, the group regrouped near the edge of the camp. Lucas glanced at his watch, his voice low. We have 2 minutes before the charges go off. Move. They retreated into the darkness, their footsteps quick but measured. The first explosion shattered the quiet night, followed by a chain of deafening blasts. Flames erupted in the camp, illuminating the chaos as Axel's men scrambled to respond. Lucas turned to the group. Keep moving. We're not out of this yet. The mission had been a success, but the tension lingered as the group returned to Red Pine. Lucas couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. Axel would retaliate, and when he did, it would be with everything he had. Alara approached him as they entered the town. "You pulled it off, but at what cost? Axel won't take this lying down." "I know," Lucas said, his voice quiet, "but we've bought ourselves time, and sometimes that's all you need." The air in Red Pine was electric with anticipation. The townspeople, armed and alert, manned their stations at the barricades and rooftops. After the successful sabotage of Axel's supply depot, the Iron Fang's retaliation felt inevitable. Lucas, standing atop the sheriff's office with binoculars in hand, scanned the horizon. The morning sun cast long shadows across the dirt roads leading into town, but so far there was no sign of the enemy. Alara climbed the ladder to join him, her rifle slung over her shoulder. "Anything?" "Not yet," Lucas replied, lowering the binoculars, "but it's just a matter of time." Alara nodded, her expression tense. "The town's ready as they'll ever be. Sandbags are in place and the volunteers know their roles." "Good," Lucas said. "Let's hope it's enough." By midday, the first signs of the Iron Fang's approach came in the form of distant dust clouds. Scouts on horseback galloped back into town, their faces pale. "They're coming," one of them shouted. "Dozens of bikes and trucks, maybe more." Lucas descended the ladder and began issuing orders. "Positions, everyone. Stick to the plan. We hold the barricades at all costs." Victor and Jess joined him at the main barricade, their expressions grim. "This is it," Victor said. "They'll hit hard, but we've got the advantage of defense." Lucas nodded. "Stay sharp. We only get one shot at this." The roar of engines grew louder, and soon the Iron Fangs appeared on the horizon. Axel rode at the front, his bike flanked by heavily armed men in trucks. The gang's makeshift flag, a black banner adorned with a red skull, fluttered behind them. Axel stopped just out of rifle range, dismounting his bike with practiced ease. He raised a megaphone to his lips, his voice booming across the barricades. "Red Pine, you had your chance to surrender, and you threw it away. Now you'll pay the price." Lucas stepped forward, his rifle slung across his back. "We're not afraid of you, Axel. You've underestimated us before, and you'll regret it again." Axel laughed, a cold, mirthless sound. "We'll see about that." He turned to his men, raising his arm. "Burn it down." The Iron Fangs surged forward, their vehicles kicking up clouds of dust as they charged. Lucas shouted into his radio, "Hold your fire until they're close." The first wave hit the barricades with a deafening crash. The Iron Fangs threw Molotov cocktails and makeshift grenades, igniting sections of the defenses. Volunteers returned fire from behind cover, their shots precise and measured. Nate, stationed on a rooftop with a scoped rifle, picked off bikers as they tried to scale the barricades. "Got one," he shouted, his voice carrying over the chaos. Alara moved along the eastern flank, coordinating the town's defenses. She spotted a group of bikers attempting to flank the barricade and signaled a team of volunteers to intercept them. "Stay low and keep moving," she ordered. Lucas, at the center of the battle, fought with calculated precision. He fired at an approaching truck, hitting the driver and sending the vehicle careening into a ditch. "Focus on the vehicles," he shouted. "Take out their mobility." Despite the townspeople's efforts, the Iron Fangs began to breach the outer defenses. Axel, wielding a chain, led a group of bikers through a gap in the barricade. Lucas intercepted him, the two locking eyes amid the chaos. "Lucas," Axel sneered, "you've been a thorn in my side for too long." "Funny," Lucas replied, raising his rifle. "I was about to say the same to you." Axel swung his chain, forcing Lucas to dodge. The two exchanged blows, their fight brutal and unrelenting. Around them, the battle raged on, with both sides suffering heavy casualties. On the western flank, Victor and Jess led a counterattack to push back the bikers who had breached the defenses. Victor, armed with a shotgun, moved with precision, taking down enemies at close range. Jess, using her knowledge of the terrain, directed volunteers to ambush the invaders. "We're holding here," Victor shouted, reloading his weapon. "Don't let them through." Meanwhile, Ilara regrouped with Nate on the rooftops, providing covering fire for the volunteers below. "We need to take out that truck," she yelled, pointing to a vehicle mounted with a heavy machine gun. Nate nodded, adjusting his aim. He fired a single shot, hitting the gunner and silencing the threat. "Got it!" As the battle dragged on, the tide began to turn in Red Pine's favor. The townspeople, though outnumbered, fought with a resolve that the Iron Fangs couldn't match. Axel, realizing the fight was slipping away, called for a retreat. "This isn't over, Lucas," Axel shouted as he mounted his bike. "You'll pay for this." Lucas watched as the Iron Fangs retreated into the distance, their forces battered and broken. The fires in Red Pine still smoldered, and the ground was littered with debris, but the town had held. The aftermath was bittersweet. Volunteers moved through the streets, tending to the wounded and extinguishing fires. Lucas stood at the center of town, his clothes stained with dirt and blood. Ilara approached, her face streaked with soot. "We did it. We actually did it." Lucas nodded, his expression weary. "But at what cost? This is just the beginning. Axel won't stop until we finish this for good." Victor joined them, his shotgun slung over his shoulder. "Then we'd better be ready, because he'll be back, and he'll be desperate." Lucas looked out at the horizon, the faint dust trail of the retreating Iron Fangs still visible. "We'll be ready." The aftermath of the first battle against the Iron Fangs left Red Pine battered but unbroken. Fires had been extinguished, barricades hastily rebuilt, and the wounded tended to with whatever supplies remained. Yet the town had a sense of grim determination. They had stood against Axel's forces and lived to tell the tale. A small victory, but one that came at a cost. Lucas walked through the streets, his boots crunching against the rubble. Volunteers worked tirelessly to restore some semblance of order. He stopped near the town square, where a group of residents was reinforcing a barricade. Clara, the young nurse who had become an unlikely leader among the civilians, caught his eye. "Lucas," Clara called out, wiping sweat from her brow, "we're running low on medical supplies. If we don't get more soon, we won't be able to handle another attack." Lucas nodded. "I'll figure something out. You've been doing great work, Clara. Keep it up." Clara gave him a tired smile before returning to her task. Lucas's jaw tightened. The reality of their situation weighed heavily on him. They had bought themselves time, but Axel wouldn't stay down for long. That evening, a council of sorts convened in the town hall. Victor, Jess, Ilara, Nate, and a few other key figures gathered around a table covered in maps and hastily scribbled notes. The atmosphere was tense, the stakes higher than ever. Victor leaned over the map, pointing to a nearby settlement. "If we're going to hold out, we need allies. There's a group in Ashford, about 30 miles west. They've fought off gangs before. If we can convince them to join us, it could turn the tide." Lucas frowned. "And what happens if Axel attacks while we're gone? We can't leave Red Pine defenseless." Jess chimed in. "We don't have a choice. The Iron Fangs will regroup, and when they come back, they'll be stronger. If we don't strengthen our numbers, this town won't survive." Ilara crossed her arms, her expression skeptical. "And what makes you think Ashford will help us? For all we know, they could see us as a liability." Victor shrugged. "It's a risk, but it's one worth taking. We've got to try." Lucas sighed, rubbing the bridge of his nose. He knew they were right. If Red Pine was to have any chance of surviving, they needed reinforcements. "All right," he said finally. "We'll send a small team to Ashford. Victor, you'll lead it. Jess, you're with him. The rest of us will stay here and hold the fort." The next morning, Victor and Jess prepared to depart. They loaded supplies onto a truck, double-checking their weapons and gear. Clara approached with a small bag of medical supplies. "It's not much, but it's all I can spare," she said. Victor took the bag with a nod. "Thanks. We'll do what we can to bring back more." Jess turned to Lucas. "Hold the line while we're gone. We'll be back as soon as we can." "Stay safe," Lucas said, his voice steady. And if you run into trouble, don't hesitate to pull back. Red Pine needs you alive." Victor offered a faint smile. "You too." As the truck disappeared into the distance, Lucas felt a pang of unease. The journey to Ashford was dangerous, and there was no guarantee of success. But there was no turning back now. Back in Red Pine, preparations for the next battle continued. Lucas worked alongside the townspeople, fortifying defenses and organizing patrols. Nate, ever the optimist, tried to lighten the mood with his usual humor. "You know," Nate said as he hammered a plank into place, "if we survive this, I think I'll open a bakery. Something quiet, no explosions, just bread and pastries." Alara smirked. "I'll believe that when I see it." "Hey, I'm serious," Nate protested. "I've always wanted to try my hand at sourdough." Lucas couldn't help but chuckle. Amid the chaos and uncertainty, moments like these reminded him of what they were fighting for. 2 days passed with no word from Victor and Jess. The tension in Red Pine grew with each passing hour. Scouts reported no signs of Axel's forces, but Lucas knew better than to let his guard down. Axel was out there, planning his next move. On the third night, as Lucas patrolled the outskirts of town, a faint noise caught his attention. He raised his hand, signaling the nearby guards to hold their positions. The sound grew louder, a low rumble accompanied by the faint glow of headlights. Lucas's heart sank. The Iron Fangs were back. The alarm rang out through Red Pine, waking the town from its uneasy slumber. Volunteers scrambled to their positions, weapons in hand. Lucas climbed to the rooftop of the sheriff's office, binoculars in hand. What he saw made his blood run cold. The Iron Fangs had returned, but this time they weren't alone. Axel had rallied reinforcements, dozens of bikes, trucks, and even an armored vehicle. The gang was a force to be reckoned with, and they were heading straight for Red Pine. Alara joined him on the rooftop, her face pale but determined. "This is it, isn't it?" Lucas nodded. "Yeah, this is the turning point." As the Iron Fangs approached, Lucas grabbed his radio and issued orders. "Everyone, hold your positions. Don't fire until I give the signal." The townspeople braced themselves, their faces a mixture of fear and resolve. The battle for Red Pine was about to begin. The Iron Fangs arrived at Red Pine's borders with the force of a storm. Engines roared like thunder, headlights cutting through the dark, and the gang's makeshift flag waved proudly in the night. From the rooftops and barricades, Red Pine's defenders watched with bated breath, their hands tightening on their weapons. Axel's presence at the head of the gang was unmistakable. His towering frame and the glint of his signature chain sent a chill through the air. Lucas stood atop the sheriff's office, his binoculars fixed on the advancing horde. Beside him, Alara knelt with her rifle, her sharp eyes scanning the enemy's movements. "They're better organized this time," she muttered. "Looks like Axel learned his lesson." "Or he's more desperate," Lucas replied. He lowered the binoculars and grabbed his radio. "Everyone, remember the plan. Hold your positions and conserve your ammo. We only shoot when they're in range." The gang's vehicles came to a halt just outside the range of the town's defenders. Axel dismounted from his bike, his boots crunching against the gravel as he approached the barricades. He raised a megaphone, his voice carrying over the stillness. "Red Pine," he called. "You had your chance to surrender. You had your chance to walk away. Now, you'll see the price of defiance." Lucas stepped forward on the rooftop, his voice cutting through the night. "We're not afraid of you, Axel. We stood against you once, and we'll do it again." Axel's laughter echoed across the battlefield. "You think you're heroes, don't you? Protecting your little town. But pride has a price, and you're about to pay it." With a signal from Axel, the Iron Fangs surged forward. Trucks and bikes roared to life, their headlights piercing the darkness. The battle for Red Pine had begun. The first wave crashed against the town's defenses with brutal force. Molotov cocktails soared through the air, igniting barricades and scattering the defenders. Red Pine's volunteers returned fire, their shots ringing out in sharp bursts. The streets were bathed in the glow of flames and muzzle flashes. Nate, perched on a rooftop with a scoped rifle, picked off bikers as they approached the barricades. "One down," he muttered, quickly chambering another round. "And another. Keep them coming." On the eastern flank, Alara led a group of volunteers in repelling a squad of bikers attempting to breach the defenses. "Stay low and keep firing," she shouted, her voice cutting through the chaos. Her rifle cracked and an enemy fell. Lucas moved between positions, issuing orders and rallying the defenders. He fired at an approaching truck, his bullets striking the tires and sending the vehicle careening into a ditch. "Focus on the vehicles," he called. "Don't let them get through." Despite their determination, Red Pine's defenses began to buckle under the relentless assault. Axel, wielding his chain like a weapon, tore through the barricades with a group of his most loyal followers. The sight of him sent a ripple of fear through the defenders. Lucas intercepted him near the town square, his rifle raised. "Axel," he shouted, "it's me you want. Leave the town out of this." Axel grinned, his teeth gleaming in the firelight. "Ah, Lucas, the soldier who thinks he's a savior. Let's settle this." The two men clashed in a brutal fight, Axel swinging his chain with deadly precision while Lucas used his rifle as a makeshift staff to block and counter. Around them, the battle raged on, with both sides suffering heavy losses. On the western flank, Victor and Jess arrived just in time to reinforce the defenders. Their truck screeched to a halt, and they leapt out, weapons at the ready. Victor's shotgun roared as he took down two bikers in quick succession. "Glad to see you made it back," Alara called as she reloaded her rifle. "Wouldn't miss this for the world," Victor replied, his voice grim. "What's the situation?" "Not great," Alara admitted. "They're hitting us hard, and Axel's leading the charge." Victor nodded, his jaw tightening. "Then let's push them back." As the battle wore on, it became clear that Axel's forces were faltering. Red Pine's defenders fought with a desperation born of survival, refusing to give an inch. Volunteers rallied behind Lucas, their resolve unshaken despite the chaos. Axel, realizing the tide was turning against him, signaled for a retreat. "Fall back!" he roared, his voice cutting through the din of battle. "This isn't over!" The Iron Fangs began to withdraw, their vehicles disappearing into the night. The fires in Red Pine still smoldered, and the ground was littered with debris, but the town had held once again. In the aftermath of the battle, Red Pine survivors gathered in the town square. The wounded were tended to, and the dead were mourned. Lucas stood at the center of it all, his clothes stained with dirt and blood. He felt the weight of every decision he had made, every life lost under his command. Alara approached, her face streaked with soot. "We did it," she said, her voice quiet. "But it feels hollow, doesn't it?" Lucas nodded. "Axel will be back, and next time he'll be more dangerous." Victor joined them, his shotgun slung over his shoulder. "Then we'd better be ready. Because pride or not, this town is worth fighting for." Lucas looked out at the horizon, the faint dust trail of the retreating Iron Fangs still visible. "We'll be ready." The morning after the battle was eerily quiet. The streets of Red Pine, once filled with the sounds of gunfire and roaring engines, now lay still, shrouded in smoke and the faint smell of burnt wood. Volunteers moved through the rubble, their faces weary but resolute. The Iron Fangs had retreated, but the town bore the scars of the fight. Lucas stood at the center of the town square surveying the damage. His clothes were still stained with dirt and blood, and his body ached from the previous night's battle. Despite their victory, he felt no sense of triumph, only the heavy weight of what had been lost. Alara approached him, her expression somber. "The wounded are stable for now, but we've lost more people than I'd like to admit," she said quietly. "How many?" Lucas asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to hear the answer. 17 dead," Alara replied. "Dozens injured. Clara's doing her best, but we're running out of supplies." Lucas clenched his fists, his jaw tightening. We need to send for more. If Axel comes back and we're not ready—" He trailed off, unable to finish the thought. Alara put a hand on his shoulder, her grip firm. "We'll figure it out. We always do." For a moment, Lucas allowed himself to feel the weight of her words. It wasn't just reassurance. It was a reminder of the strength they had built together. "We'll make it through this," he said, more to himself than to her. The town hall became a makeshift command center as Lucas and the remaining leaders gathered to assess their situation. Victor and Jess, fresh from their return, were among those present. Maps and notes cluttered the tables, and the atmosphere was tense. Victor broke the silence. "Ashford isn't an option. The town's been overrun by another gang. We barely made it out alive." Jess nodded grimly. "They've fortified the place. There's no way they'll help us." Lucas swore under his breath. "Then we're on our own." "We've held out this long," Nate said, attempting to inject some optimism. "Red Pine's tougher than they think." Alara shot him a sharp look. "We can't rely on toughness alone. We need a plan, and we need it fast." Lucas leaned over the map, his mind racing. "We'll reinforce the defenses and ration our supplies. We have to prepare for the worst." Victor frowned. "And what about morale? People are tired, Lucas. They're scared." Jess added, "A town can only fight for so long before it breaks." Lucas exhaled slowly, his gaze hardening. "Then we give them a reason to keep going. If they see us fighting, they'll keep fighting." Jess leaned closer to the map, tracing a potential supply route. "We might still be able to scavenge from the outskirts of Ashford. It's a risk, but we don't have many options." As the day wore on, the townspeople worked tirelessly to rebuild. Barricades were repaired, and supplies were inventoried. Clara, though exhausted, continued to tend to the wounded, her hands steady despite the chaos around her. Lucas found her in the small clinic that had been set up in the church. She was stitching a volunteer's arm, her face a mask of concentration. "You're doing good work, Clara," Lucas said, his voice soft. She looked up briefly, her eyes tired but resolute. "I'm just trying to keep people alive. That's all that matters right now." Lucas nodded. "If there's anything you need, let me know." "More supplies," Clara said bluntly, "and maybe a miracle." Lucas managed a faint smile. "I'll see what I can do." Nearby, a young girl sat by her father's bedside, holding his hand as Clara worked. The sight reminded Lucas of what they were fighting for. The families, the future of Red Pine. It wasn't just about survival. It was about preserving hope. That evening, Lucas found himself alone on the rooftop of the sheriff's office. The town stretched out below him, battered but standing. He thought about the people they had lost, the sacrifices that had been made, and the battles still to come. Alara joined him, her footsteps light against the wooden planks. "Can't sleep?" she asked. Lucas shook his head. "Too much on my mind." She leaned against the railing, her gaze distant. "We've come a long way since this started, but sometimes I wonder if it's enough. If we're enough." "We don't have a choice," Lucas said. "We keep fighting because we have to. Because if we don't, who will?" Alara nodded, though her expression remained troubled. "Do you ever think about what happens after all this? If we win?" Lucas hesitated before answering. "I try not to. Winning feels like a distant dream right now." They stood in silence for a while, the cool night air brushing against them. For a brief moment, the weight of their struggles felt just a little lighter. The next morning, a group of scouts returned with news that sent a ripple of unease through the town. Axel's forces had regrouped, but their numbers were smaller than expected. It seemed that the Iron Fangs were splintering under the strain of their losses. Victor, always the pragmatist, saw this as an opportunity. "If we strike now, we could finish them off. Cut the head off the snake before it grows back." Alara shook her head. "We're not ready for another fight. The town needs time to recover." Lucas listened to both sides, weighing the risks. "We'll hold our ground for now," he said finally, "but we'll keep a close eye on Axel. If he makes a move, we'll be ready." Ilara lingered for a moment as the others began to disperse. "You're carrying a lot, Lucas. Just don't forget you're only human." Lucas met her gaze, the weight of her words settling heavily on him. "I won't, but I don't have the luxury of stopping." Axel stood at the edge of the clearing, the familiar woods stretching out before him. The trees, once a symbol of freedom, now seemed like an endless sea of shadow. The sun had set hours ago, and the air was thick with the weight of what was to come. He had spent years running from his past, hiding from the man he used to be, but now, standing here, he felt the pull of fate. Red Pine had changed, and so had he. It had been days since Axel had returned to the town, days since he had made the decision to face his past and confront the wrongs he had done. The people of Red Pine had been skeptical, and for good reason. He had betrayed them once, left them to face the consequences of his actions while he ran off to live a life of selfish indulgence. But now, as the town rebuilt itself, Axel knew that he couldn't just fade into the background. He had to make amends. He had to prove that he could change. He had found his place at the town's outskirts, working alongside the survivors who had remained after the battle. They were building something new, something stronger than before, but there was still the weight of the past to carry. It wasn't just the walls that needed rebuilding. The trust had been shattered, and Axel had no illusions about the long road ahead. Axel's redemption wasn't going to come from grand gestures or heroic acts. It would come from the small moments, from proving that he could be a man who fought for others, not just for himself. As he worked alongside the people of Red Pine, he began to realize that it wasn't about earning forgiveness. It was about earning back the respect he had lost. The only way to do that was by showing up, day after day, putting in the work without expecting praise or recognition. And so, Axel worked. He cut timber, helped fortify the town's defenses, and lent a hand wherever it was needed. His presence was still met with suspicion, and there were times when the whispers of his past seemed to follow him like a shadow. But Axel didn't shy away from it. He embraced the discomfort, the challenge of being a man who had to prove his worth over and over again. It wasn't long before Axel found himself face to face with the one person who could either grant him redemption or condemn him forever. Ilara. She had been the heart of the town's resistance, the one who had kept them going when everything seemed lost. She was strong, unwavering, and the last person who would forgive someone like Axel for abandoning them. When they first crossed paths after his return, the tension had been palpable. Ilara's eyes held a coldness that Axel could feel deep in his bones. She wasn't interested in hearing excuses or apologies. She wanted action. She wanted results. But Axel understood. He had no right to ask for forgiveness. He had to earn it, just like he had to earn the right to be part of this new chapter of Red Pine's history. Their first real conversation took place one evening after a long day of rebuilding. The sun was setting, casting a golden hue over the town. Axel had been working near the perimeter when he saw Ilara standing at the edge of the camp, looking out into the distance. She looked like she was lost in thought, her face illuminated by the last rays of the sun. Axel hesitated for a moment, then made his way over to her. He had no plan, no script for what he was about to say, but it didn't matter. He had come this far. It was time to face the consequences of his past. "Ilara," he said quietly, his voice steady but filled with uncertainty. She turned slowly, her expression unreadable. "What do you want, Axel?" Axel swallowed hard, his gaze meeting hers. He knew that there was no easy way to say this, but it had to be said. "I'm sorry, for everything, for leaving, for abandoning you all when you needed me most." Ilara's eyes narrowed, her jaw tightening. "You don't get to apologize, Axel. You don't get to come back and expect us to just forget what you did." "I'm not asking you to forget," Axel replied, his voice low but firm. "I'm asking you to see that I've changed. I'm not the same person I was when I left. I've spent the last few years running from my mistakes, but now I'm here, and I'm ready to make things right." There was a long silence as Alara studied him. Axel could see the skepticism in her eyes, the doubt that lingered just beneath the surface. She had every right to question his motives, to distrust him. But for the first time in a long time, Axel didn't feel like he had to explain himself. He didn't need to convince her with words. He just needed to show up, day after day, and prove that he was ready to do the hard work. Finally, Alara spoke. "You've got a long way to go before you can make up for what you've done, but I'm willing to give you a chance. Just remember, actions speak louder than words." Axel nodded, feeling a sense of relief wash over him. It wasn't a perfect resolution, but it was a start. It was a small step in the right direction, and that was all he needed. As the days turned into weeks, Axel continued to work alongside the people of Red Pine, earning their trust, one small act at a time. There were moments when he wanted to give up, moments when the weight of his past seemed too much to bear. But he kept pushing forward, kept doing the work that needed to be done, even when it felt like he was walking through a sea of doubt. And slowly, very slowly, the people began to change their perception of him. It wasn't immediate, and it wasn't easy, but Axel had learned one thing throughout this entire journey. Redemption wasn't about instant forgiveness. It was about earning it, piece by piece, until it became a part of who he was. One evening, as Axel sat by the fire, the warmth of the flames dancing on his face, he saw Alara walking toward him. She didn't say anything at first, but her presence was enough. It was clear that she had seen the change in him, that she had begun to trust him again. "You've done good work, Axel," she said quietly, sitting down beside him. "It's not easy to come back from what you did, but you've shown us that you're willing to try." Axel looked at her, his heart pounding in his chest. "I'll keep trying. I won't stop until I've earned back everything I took from you." Alara nodded. "We'll see." The tension in Red Pine following Axel's unexpected arrival was palpable. Lucas had agreed to let him stay temporarily under strict supervision, but trust was hard to come by. Most of the townspeople avoided him, their glares sharp and filled with suspicion. Axel, for his part, kept to himself, spending his days helping with repairs or sitting quietly in the town square. Alara, however, couldn't shake her unease. "This is a mistake," she told Lucas as they stood near the barricades watching Axel stack sandbags. "You're risking everything we've built by letting him stay." Lucas sighed, his eyes heavy with weariness. "I know it's a risk, but if there's a chance he's sincere, if he can help us, it's worth it." Alara crossed her arms. "He's a killer, Lucas. You've seen what he's done. What makes you think he's capable of change?" Lucas met her gaze, his tone calm but resolute. "Because I've seen what happens when people don't get a chance to change. I'm not saying I trust him, Alara, but I have to try. For Red Pine." Alara frowned, shaking her head. "I hope you're right, because if you're wrong, we won't get another chance." That evening, Lucas called a meeting with his closest allies. Alara, Victor, Jess, and Nate gathered in the sheriff's office, the room dimly lit by a single lantern. The weight of Red Pine's survival hung in the air, unspoken but deeply felt. "We need supplies," Lucas began, his tone heavy. "Clara's running low on everything, and if we don't resupply soon, we won't be ready for another attack." Jess nodded, her expression grim. "There's an old warehouse about 20 miles north. It's risky, but it might have what we need." Victor frowned, his arms crossed. "That's deep in Iron Fang territory. If they catch wind of us, we're done." Lucas turned to Alara. "That's why I want you to lead this mission. You're the best shot we've got, and I trust your instincts." Alara blinked, caught off guard. "You want me to go while Axel is here? What if this is a distraction?" Lucas's jaw tightened. I'll keep an eye on him, but right now this mission is our priority. We can't wait. After a long pause, Ilara nodded. Fine, but I'm taking Nate with me, and if anything goes wrong, we'll handle it, Lucas assured her. The next morning, Ilara and Nate prepared for their journey. Their truck was loaded with empty crates and basic supplies, their weapons checked and double-checked. Clara handed Ilara a small medical kit as she climbed into the driver's seat. Be careful out there, Clara said, her voice steady despite the worry in her eyes. And bring back whatever you can. Ilara gave a curt nod. We'll do our best. The drive to the warehouse was tense. Nate, ever the optimist, tried to lighten the mood. You know, after this I think I'll retire and open that bakery I keep talking about. Ilara smirked, glancing at him. You've been talking about that bakery for years. What's stopping you? Bullets, mostly, Nate replied with a grin. Despite herself, Ilara chuckled. For a moment, the tension eased, but as they approached the warehouse, the mood shifted. The building loomed in the distance, its windows shattered and its walls scarred by time. Ilara parked the truck a safe distance away, and they approached cautiously, their weapons drawn. Inside, the air was stale and heavy with dust. Shelves lined the walls, many of them empty or toppled over. Ilara motioned for Nate to check the left side while she took the right. Found something, Nate whispered, holding up a box of canned goods. Not much, but it's a start. Ilara nodded. Keep looking. There's got to be more. The faint sound of footsteps echoed from the far end of the warehouse. Ilara froze, signaling Nate to take cover. Her heart raced as she peered around the corner. A group of bikers clad in Iron Fang colors entered, their voices loud and careless as they joked and scavenged. Of course it couldn't be easy, Nate muttered, his tone laced with frustration. Ilara glared at him. Stay quiet. We can't afford a fight. The bikers began rummaging through the shelves, unaware of Ilara and Nate's presence. Ilara's mind raced as she considered their options. If they waited too long, the bikers might take everything. But if they engaged, the noise could attract more attention. After a moment's hesitation, she motioned for Nate to follow her as they crept toward the exit, keeping low and moving slowly. Every step felt agonizingly loud, but the bikers remained distracted. Once outside, Ilara let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. We'll circle around and load whatever we can. Quietly. Nate nodded, his expression unusually serious. Let's make it quick. They worked swiftly, loading crates into the truck without drawing attention. The tension was palpable, every sound amplified in the stillness of the night. As they secured the last crate, the sudden roar of a motorcycle engine echoed from inside the warehouse. Ilara's eyes widened in alarm. Time to go. They scrambled into the truck and Ilara slammed her foot on the gas. The vehicle lurched forward, tires spinning as the bikers poured out of the warehouse, shouting and firing their weapons. Bullets pinged off the truck's frame as Ilara swerved to avoid incoming fire. Hold on, she shouted, her grip white-knuckled on the wheel. Nate leaned out the window, his rifle in hand. He fired a few precise shots, forcing the bikers to scatter. That should slow them down. As they sped down the road, the warehouse fading into the distance, Ilara finally allowed herself to breathe. We made it. Nate grinned, his usual humor returning. Told you it'd be fine. Now, about that bakery. Ilara rolled her eyes but allowed a small smile. Let's get home first. Lucas stood near the edge of Red Pine, his hands resting on the hood of an old truck. The sun was setting, casting long shadows over the town. Behind him, the sounds of the town settling for the night echoed. Distant chatter, children laughing, the creak of wooden beams in the wind. It was a fleeting sense of peace, a moment of calm before the next storm. He had spent months fighting for Red Pine, leading its people through battle after battle, trying to protect a town that had become his home. But now it was time for him to leave. The weight of leadership had become too much to bear, and he knew it was time to step aside. The sun dipped lower, and Lucas felt the familiar pang of regret in his chest. He had fought so hard, so relentlessly, for something that was now slipping away. His past decisions had been guided by a singular focus: survival. But now, after everything, he knew there was more to leading than just surviving. He could still hear the voices of the people he had fought for, the townsfolk who had looked to him for guidance. Some of them had doubted him, some had lost faith, but others had followed him with unwavering trust. And now he was leaving them behind, not because he wanted to, but because he had to. The weight of the town's survival had crushed him, and the decision to step down was the hardest one he had ever made. Ilara approached, her boots crunching on the gravel as she walked up beside him. She didn't say anything at first, just stood there, her eyes on the horizon. Lucas could feel the tension in her, the unspoken words between them. She had been his closest ally, his most trusted friend, but now there was an unbridgeable distance between them. "You're really going through with this, aren't you?" Ilara asked, her voice low but firm. Lucas nodded, his throat tight. "I have to. Red Pine needs someone who can lead them without all the baggage I'm carrying, someone who can think clearly, make the tough decisions. I'm not that person anymore." Ilara sighed, her gaze flickering between Lucas and the town behind them. "We've been through a lot together. I don't understand why you think leaving is the answer." "Because it's not just about fighting anymore," Lucas replied. "It's about rebuilding, and I can't do that. Not like this." Ilara's eyes narrowed. "You've been the backbone of this town. You can't just walk away." "I'm not walking away," Lucas said, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm stepping aside. It's time for someone else to take the reins. Someone who can build a future for Red Pine, instead of just surviving in the ruins of the past." The conversation hung in the air, both of them unsure of what to say next. Ilara took a step back, looking at the town once more, her thoughts running wild. Lucas had always been the one to hold things together, to lead the charge, but now, as he prepared to leave, everything felt fragile. "I don't know if I can do this without you," Ilara said, her voice almost breaking. "I've always had you by my side. Now, I don't know what to think." "You don't have to do it alone," Lucas said softly. "You've got Victor. You've got Jess. They can carry this town forward. They'll be fine without me." Ilara's gaze softened, but there was a flicker of doubt in her eyes. "I don't know if anyone can replace you." "I'm not trying to be replaced," Lucas said, meeting her gaze, "but I'm not the man I was when I first came here, and I don't think I can lead them anymore, not the way they need. You've seen the toll it's taken on me, the choices I've had to make. I can't keep carrying that burden. Not anymore." The two stood there for a moment, the silence between them heavier than ever. Finally, Ilara spoke again, her voice tinged with both sadness and understanding. "If this is what you need, I can't stop you. But don't think for a second that you failed us. You haven't." Lucas turned toward her, offering a faint smile. "I'm not running from my past, Ilara. I'm just trying to find a way to move forward. For me, for Red Pine." A long pause followed before Ilara spoke again. "Who's going to take over?" Lucas didn't hesitate. "Victor. He's the right person. He's tough, but he knows when to listen. He'll do what's right for Red Pine, even when it's hard." Later that evening, Lucas packed his things. His decision had been made, and there was no turning back. He could feel the weight of the town's eyes on him, as if they were all waiting for him to change his mind. But this wasn't a decision he could undo. He had tried to protect Red Pine with everything he had, but now he had to protect himself. His body was worn down, his mind stretched to its limits. The people of Red Pine deserved more than he could give. Ilara was the last one to say goodbye. She stood outside the truck as Lucas slid into the driver's seat. Her eyes were tired, but there was a certain peace in them now, a quiet acceptance. "I guess this is it," she said. "Yeah," Lucas replied, his voice soft. "Take care of this town, Alara. I know you will. You take care of yourself, too." With that, Lucas drove away. The sound of his truck faded into the distance, and Red Pine was left with a gaping hole where its leader once stood. But even in his absence there was a sense of hope, a sense that maybe, just maybe, this town could survive without him. The morning after Lucas's departure was filled with uncertainty. Red Pine, once led by a man who had been its guiding force, was now adrift. As the sun rose, the people of the town slowly began to adjust to the idea that things would never be the same again. Some were hopeful, others nervous. The question lingered: who would lead them now? Victor had stepped into the role of interim leader, but the weight of the responsibility was heavy on his shoulders. He had always been more of a strategist, someone who took action, not a man who sought to lead an entire town. Yet here he was, making sure supplies were distributed, organizing defenses, attempting to keep the morale of the people intact. But among the uncertainty, there was one person who still saw a path forward: Nate. His vision didn't rely on brute strength or brilliance, but on something deeper. He believed Red Pine needed to rebuild not just its walls and its defenses, but its spirit. Nate sat on his porch, sipping coffee. He watched the town come to life. Children running, vendors setting up stalls, repairs continuing. It was a sight that filled him with quiet hope. Despite everything, Red Pine was still standing. He leaned back, closing his eyes for a moment as the sun warmed his face. He had always been the optimist, the one who saw the best in situations when others saw only despair. But the past few days had taken their toll. The town was recovering, but now, with Lucas gone, they needed more than survival. They needed hope, unity, leadership that inspired, not fear. Nate had never aspired to lead. He had been content with his role, helping out, making people laugh, offering support. But now, with Lucas gone and Victor struggling, Nate knew the town needed someone who could bring them together. As the day wore on, Nate found himself walking through the square. Familiar faces, some nodded at him, others avoided his gaze. The tension was palpable. The town needed direction, but it was unclear where that would come from. He walked toward the makeshift town hall where Victor met with other key figures. Nate paused outside the door, hearing voices. He hesitated before stepping inside. Victor looked up as Nate entered, offering a tight-lipped smile. "I was wondering when you'd show up." "I've been busy," Nate replied, his usual humor absent. "I've been thinking." Victor gestured to a chair. "Sit down. What's on your mind?" Nate took a seat. Red Pine's not just about defending walls anymore. It's about something more, something that doesn't come from strategy or firepower. It's about spirit. It's about bringing the people together, making them believe in a future here. Victor raised an eyebrow. "How do you plan on doing that? We're not in a position for rallies." "I'm not talking about rallies," Nate said. "I'm talking about a vision, a way forward. We need to remind the people why they're here, why they're still standing. We need to inspire them." Victor looked skeptical. "Inspire them? With what, exactly? We're struggling to keep the lights on." "I know," Nate replied. "But if we don't have hope, if we don't have a reason to believe we're fighting for something worth saving, then what's the point? People will lose heart." Victor sat back. "You really think it can work?" "I have to," Nate replied. "Otherwise, what's the point of fighting?" Later, Nate gathered a small group in the square. They weren't soldiers, but they were the heart of Red Pine. The farmers, shopkeepers, parents, people who had stayed. Nate felt the weight of uncertainty. Could he do this? Could he guide the town? "Listen up," Nate said. "I believe in this town. We've been through hell, but we're still here, and that's not luck. It's because we're strong. We fight for each other, for our homes, for our future." He paused. "If we come together, help each other, we can rebuild Red Pine into something stronger." The crowd was silent for a moment. Then, one by one, they nodded. A quiet sense of unity spread among them. As the days passed, Nate's vision began to take shape. It wasn't about grand gestures. It was about small acts, about working together, showing the town they were more than survivors. They were a community with a future. Nate worked closely with Victor, helping him plan strategies for rebuilding and reinforcing defenses. He also worked with Jess to organize trade routes and ensure everyone had what they needed. The town of Red Pine had survived the hardest winter in years. The months had been filled with struggle, but as the first warm breezes of spring began to sweep through the valley, there was a sense of relief. The worst was over, and now they could begin the hard work of rebuilding. For the first time since Lucas had left, the people of Red Pine were beginning to come together. The spirit of the town was no longer broken, but whole again. It wasn't perfect, far from it, but there was a unity that hadn't been there before. Nate's vision had become their reality, a community built not on fear, but on trust, solidarity, and hope. As the season changed, so too did the people. The shift was gradual but noticeable. People who had once been hesitant to trust each other began to work together with more ease. Those who had stayed silent now spoke up, offering their ideas and resources. The town had become more than a place of survival. It was becoming a home again. However, even amidst the growing sense of hope, there was one person who was struggling to accept the changes: Ilara. Ilara had always been the strongest among them. She had led countless missions, kept everyone alive through the worst of it, and fought with everything she had for Red Pine. But now, as the town began to rebuild, she felt adrift. Her role was no longer defined by the fights and strategies that had kept them alive. In the quieter moments, she found herself questioning her place in the new world they were creating. She had spent so long fighting, so long being the one everyone turned to when things seemed impossible, that she didn't know who she was without that. The weight of leadership was heavy, but the lack of it was even more suffocating. Red Pine needed her, but how could she fit into a future that didn't demand her constant vigilance? One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a soft glow over the town, Ilara found herself on the outskirts of Red Pine, overlooking the valley. She was alone, trying to make sense of the feelings she couldn't escape. The world was changing around her, and she wasn't sure if she was ready to change with it. Her thoughts were interrupted by a familiar voice. "Ilara." She turned to see Nate approaching, his hands stuffed into the pockets of his jacket. He looked tired, but there was a certain peace in his expression that she envied. They stood in silence for a moment, watching the sun set. "You've been avoiding everyone," Nate said, breaking the silence. Ilara sighed, her eyes never leaving the horizon. "I don't know where I fit in anymore, Nate." He nodded, as if he had expected that answer. "I think everyone feels that way. It's not just you." "I'm not so sure about that," Ilara muttered. "You've got a vision. Everyone seems to have found their place. But me, I don't know what I'm supposed to do. I don't know who I am now that the fighting's over." Nate stepped closer, his gaze thoughtful. "The fight isn't over. It's just different now. Red Pine is rebuilding, but that doesn't mean we don't need you. It just means that we need you in a different way." Ilara looked at him, her brow furrowed. "How?" Nate smiled, his eyes full of understanding. "You're not just the warrior anymore, Ilara. You're one of the pillars of this town. You fought for so long, but now, maybe it's time to build something, to help others build something. Maybe it's time to take the strength you have and use it to help others grow, instead of always fighting for survival." For a moment, Ilara didn't know how to respond. She had spent so much time focusing on the fight, on what she had to do to protect everyone, that she had never stopped to think about the future beyond the battles. But as she stood there, looking out over the valley, something inside her began to shift. The next few days were a turning point for Ilara. She still struggled with finding her place, but the more she thought about Nate's words, the more she realized that there was room for her in this new world. She didn't have to keep fighting for survival every single day. She could help Red Pine grow, help it thrive. She could be part of something bigger than herself. And so she began to rebuild not just the town, but herself. She took on roles that she had never considered before, teaching younger generations the skills they would need, helping women in the town find their strength, working alongside the builders to strengthen Red Pine's future. She had long been the one holding the line, but now she was helping others hold it too. Each day brought new challenges. At first, it felt strange, uncomfortable, but as Alara watched the children learn from her, the women who had once been hesitant began to lead small efforts, and the town itself began to take shape. She realized that this was what she had been missing. It wasn't just about fighting for survival anymore. It was about building, growing, thriving.